Many of you may already be familiar with the rumors spreading around the city about underground passages in the old part of Snezhinsk. We tried to find out more about it, and with the help of one of the readers of Window, came to the source of interest to us. The first telephone conversation with this person was very uncomfortable and, to our great regret, ended up going nowhere. However, 2 days later he came to the editorial office himself and quite unexpectedly agreed to tell us everything. The nearly 4-hour story had the effect of a bombshell. Those who listened to it, as well as those who later transcribed the dictaphone recording, were still walking a week later with eyes inflamed from sleepless nights. Opinions were extremely polarized, but all unanimously agreed on one thing: it was sensational. After understandable hesitations, we decided to publish the story practically as we heard it. A slight literary processing is connected with the preparation of the material for printing, peculiarities of the speaker's speech, and the already mentioned quality of the recording. Omitted are also a number of not quite fair, in our opinion, statements about specific leaders of the city and the Russian Scientific Research Institute of Technical Physics. We accepted the challenge of the author, who claimed that the editorial board was afraid to print his revelations. For an independent journal such as Okno, there is no reason to refuse to publish such materials. However, we are aware that after the second or third issue, and the publication is planned for at least 10 issues, there will be perplexed or even indignant calls to the editorial office, so we want to immediately state that the editorial office prints this material on literary rights and takes no responsibility for the accuracy of the facts presented in it. The author's name and coordinates are available from the editorial office, but for a variety of reasons, we are not yet inclined to advertise them. One more thing. Our esteemed visitor. For about a month we couldn't get into contact with you. Please come by or call the editorial office, at least so we can make sure you're all right.
I don't care if you believe me or not. If you don't believe me, I'm getting up and leaving. I'm no more interested in you than I am in this beer can. It wasn't me, it was you who checked with my former acquaintances, and I know they all called me crazy. That's fine. I've learned by now that people are used to hiding from life under the shell of their imaginary reasonableness. Let them. It's easier for them. It makes them feel better. But in fact, the most important nutcase, the most recent moron, will be just the one who wisely considers that the most important secret of our Snezhinsk is these miserable atomic bombs. After all, you would have to be out of your mind to believe that a defense system like ours was created only in the name of keeping worthless design secrets. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm just angry. I just can't get over the fact that practically no one knows the truth until now. Let's make a deal from the beginning. I'll tell you everything I've seen with my own eyes, and you'll listen to me to the end, without asking stupid questions. And I'll tell it the way I want to tell it. For me, not for you. You want me to start by saying, "and then I saw." No, you don't. If I accidentally stumbled on the source of the noise, it would be a beautiful story in the spirit of Indiana Jones. A thriller. An action movie. And I was on my way to it, you know? I was. Almost 30 years. Mastered the means. Realized the goal. And then, in the end, I realized that it was the right tool for my goal. And you will listen to me from the first to the last word, and if you are lazy or somewhere in a hurry, then I wonder if I strayed in here by mistake. I am not interested in your reaction or your further actions. I am not afraid of anyone and am not afraid of anything. I have already had experience with a psychiatrist, and that is enough to predict my future fate, right down to the last nail hammered in. But, I repeat, I'm not afraid of anyone. You'll be the first to chicken out to print what I am about to tell. I was born in Snezhinsk, in the 60s, right after the launch of Gagarin, I was born. And my name comes from there. From the time of universal optimism, universal happiness, and universal pride. I lived with my sister and parents in Sverdlov Street, in the 42nd house, across the boulevard from the tall building at Malachit. Back then, though, there was no ugly, boring 9-story building, but a beautiful hill with tall shipboard pines, looking at which I told my mother, puffing with my cleverness, "Mom, I know why there is a wind. Because the trees sway." My childhood was like any ordinary childhood. Fights in the yard with the horse driver Yasha. Uncle Zor's threats to kick my ears off when I was too annoying to the adults playing billiards. Cycling down the boulevard under the watchful eye of my parents, our windows faced the street. I remember the guys, Lisha Simonov, the Kiryunin brothers, the Buzdigarovs, who later moved to Obninsk with their parents, and others, of course. I will tell you about my first strong impression, which, I believe, largely determined my further way. At that time, next to my favorite hill, where I spent all my free time, they began to build a restaurant, the now infamous Malakit. When the box was being built, I was about 7 or 8 at the time. There was a general craze in our neighborhood, the essence of which was to avoid the guard, get into the construction site, jump through a narrow bottom window into the darkness of the basement of the new building and climb out onto the other side with the help of a board. The usual yard check for lousiness. Of course, I was at the front of the line. Having repeated this feat many times, I got quite accustomed to the darkness and spookiness. I once went a little further, climbed through a hole and suddenly saw before me a magical sight, from the ground vertically upward fantastic formation, for which I did not immediately, with difficulty, but still found the word that already existed in my language. Stalagmites. They glowed from within with a strange, greenish light, and when I touched them in awe I realized that they were made of ice. And this in the middle of the summer. For a few minutes I stood completely mesmerized by the sight before my eyes, and that sense of secret splendor stayed with me forever. I still don't know what it was. Whether the builders uncovered some underground cavity with these wonderful icicles, or whether their formation was due to some purely man-made reasons, but the fact remains, I realized that under the ground hides something that can never become accessible to a person leading an ordinary, above-ground life. Needless to say, from that moment on I didn't miss a single construction site in my hometown. I knew every brick, every stone in the construction of the Solnechny store, the 127th school, and the first commercial and cultural complex Yubiliny, which, however, in those days was called Synagorie, and only the pompous anniversary prevented it from keeping its beautiful, romantic name. Wake me up at night, and I could recount the location of pits of almost all the houses being laid on Victory Street, describe what rocks fill these man-made pits. I was fond of mineralogy then, read Fiersman, tell about trenches of communications, conducted from trench to trench, etc. My research was far from serene. Repeatedly I was caught by some individuals, mostly law-abiding citizens of nearby houses. They lectured and moralized me, insisting that a good boy should not wander around a construction site where a heavy and hard crane could fall on him. From childhood I could not stand this kind of nonsense, so very soon realized that they are more amused by the feeling of self-importance than my health and my safety, and that it is necessary, if possible, to avoid meetings with these individuals. Looking back, I realized that my reasoning was quite sound for an 8-year-old child. Once some man, having caught me in the construction of the 6th house on Victory Street, clutched at my shoulder like a tick and led me to the police station, which was then located in a 2-story building behind the Vesna store. Since he had no particular reason for this transfer, he used careless words I had said on the way to the station to complain that I had insulted the police. Not a word was said about the fact that I had been caught at the construction site. My first encounter with representatives of the law disappointed me, because the hour-long conversation between a child and an adult man in uniform resulted in the dull repetition of a single phrase, "Who taught you to call the policeman that?" I got only one thing out of it: any authority figures, which all adults seemed to think they were, should be avoided. Time has confirmed the validity of my conclusion. I repeat, it was not painless for me to learn. And not only morally, but also physically. Once, when I arrived on a bicycle on the construction of the 40th house on Lenin Street, the third long house from the music school, I did not notice the trench dug during the day and dropped into a 2-meter hole together with the bike. I am amazed how I survived it all, because my forehead was bumped against a rock, protruding from the ground, and my bike was simply folded in half, and I had to prove to my father for a long time that the curb near the shop Yolochka, which I accidentally hit, could well cause such a damage to my bike. There was a time, during the reconstruction of Gagarin Stadium, when they demolished the old wooden stand and dug a foundation pit for the new one. The summer rains of many days filled the pit with about 2 meters of water. And the damned yard bragging made me put together 2 wooden shields of the fence and set out on them for a short swim, which ended in complete disaster, and I remember very well the feeling when, being in the water, more and more often diving and less often coming up, I calmly thought, well, now I will drown. I remember the crazy eyes of a nearby citizen, feverishly stripping off his pants and plunging into the water in his simple family shorts, a citizen to whom I was deeply indebted for the rest of my life, and whom I have wanted to find all these years, to tell him thanks, which I could not say on that unfortunate day. Of course, this is all lyricism. But you must know lyrics too, to understand my troubled soul. To understand how uncontrollably and indomitably I was drawn to the depths. To realize that the obstacles on the way did not diminish my thirst to know the unknown. And to understand, finally, why one evening I stopped at a construction site in front of another communication trench and thoughtfully said to myself, "Yura, it leads somewhere." Another thing which comes to mind are that pipes laid in open trenches go somewhere underground. One day, walking along the freshly dug trench in front of the 52 house on Lennon Street, I was surprised to find that the pipes, over which the welders had been working for 2 days, were not going into the ground, into the sand, into nothing at all. I saw that a special concrete chute corridor had been laid for them, which beckoned me to visit its unknown depths. I didn't go far that day. It was not frightening. For some reason I never felt fear of the unknown. It seems that as a child I was firmly instilled a false confidence that this world was created exclusively for human use, and that there could be no real danger to life in it. It was just dark. It was then that I realized that I needed a flashlight and the ability to navigate in an unfamiliar place. At the same time, came the realization that I was breaking through an open door. I discovered that the city was full of manholes and inspection manholes, each of which was a door to an unfamiliar world. But, I did not immediately take advantage of these alluring possibilities. I must remember that I was young at the time. I had just turned 10, and I was physically unable to lift the heavy cast iron lid. I started looking for open hatches. To my surprise there were quite a few. I found them both in the area of the Glade, a continuation of Lennon Street, Three Little Pigs was not even a mention then, and in the woods behind the railroad tracks near the current store building materials, and near the garages on Novaya, which is a street then also did not exist. To the bars of the armature of the wells that were found, as if especially for me, were welded metal brackets, on which I easily went down and, shining a flashlight gifted for my birthday, explored the underground labyrinth that was opening to me. I must tell you frankly, practically every one of these passages ended in a dead end 10 or 15 meters from the place where I went down. However, the dead end was not always insurmountable. In most cases, the pipes, usually running in pairs, disappeared into an unexpectedly narrowing passageway clogged with insulation or something similar. At first this stopped me, but once I mustered my courage and climbed up the top pipe, I think it was somewhere around the city lifeguard station, and, pressing my face into the glass wool, crawled forward. My determination was rewarded. After 20 meters I felt that my clothes were no longer clinging to the rough surface of the concrete, and turning on the flashlight, I realized that I was back in a passage similar to the one I had just left. After walking 10 meters, I found the brackets and, climbing up them, I bumped my head into the lid. But this did not discourage me. I realized that I had found a way to travel underground. I cannot say that my travels brought me only positive emotions. I remember well when, while making my way from an open well in the yard of the 9th house on Vasilyev Street, opposite the former diner's area, I found under my feet a half-decomposed and foul-smelling body of some representative of the cat family or the dog family. It did not come as a shock to me, as I often found rather unappetizing things during my walks. But it was from that incident that I began to walk in the underground utilities wearing a respirator mask, which I borrowed from the painters who were painting the walls, as I remember now, in the building number 32 on Victory Street, which was now under construction. It was, if I'm not mistaken, May or June of '71. I divided the routes into good and bad, although, say, for you ground dwellers, they would all be about the same, characterized by 2 words, mud and darkness. But after all, one likes to walk from the bookstore to the Pishovik along Vasilyev Street, while another would prefer to walk across the square, past Luch and the department store. That's how I like to get from the observation well near the Preventorium to the well at the entrance to the greenhouse of the 127th school, the most convenient place to go to the surface in the evening, not through the sewer at the 11th house on Victory Street. I constantly smell feces there even on the surface, but through the clean and tidy sewer of the maintenance shop behind Yubiliny. When I was 12 years old, it occurred to me to draw a plan of the dungeons I had traversed. In principle, I knew them already. I have an excellent visual and spatial memory, but then I read a book about labyrinths, and making plans became my passion. By the way, it was then, a few times watching the work of plumbers, that I learned how to open the lids of sewer manholes. It's not difficult and doesn't require much force, even a 5th grader could do it, if you know where to insert the crowbar and how to pick up the lid. It's hard to believe, but I could lift any lid in 5 seconds, and it took me no more than 5 seconds to get inside by sliding the lid behind me, not all the way, but just enough to make it look closed. So, back to the plans. I drew the first plan without going underground. Why? I already knew everything. The city was well traversed. Dozens of caps up and down. Hundreds of hours spent underground. Thousands of impressions put away in the recesses of my memory. My parents? What parents know what their child does from 1 to 6 p.m.? After 6 I diligently did my homework, watched TV, and, I remember, even went to the swimming pool. to the diving section. The section was led by Oleg Mikhailovich, kind-hearted man, then there was Vasya Dmitriev, but I did not see him anymore. I am distracted. Although, perhaps not. It was in the pool I realized such a simple thing that the underground network cannot have no other exits to the surface in addition to sewer manholes and storm drains. More than once in my underground travels I found big, tall metal plates with inscriptions like electrical room on them, which I tried to stay away from. But once in the pool, while running with the guys through the gym, we were trying to spy on the girls in the girls' shower room. I found a door with the same inscription on the short corridor on the girls' side, and that door was slightly ajar. At the same moment, all the naked girls were out of my head, because behind the tangle of wires I saw a passage, and that passage reminded me the hell out of my underground tunnels. Something clicked in my head, and the underground plan of the 70 began to grow in my imagination with new, hitherto unknown details. Of course, that day, fleeing from the furious technicians, I did not even try to get into the pool's panel room. I never went in there at all. But a few years later, when I saw that door from the inside, I remembered everything and involuntarily smiled. Since that day, in my underground travels, I stopped missing the doors that were occasionally found in the concrete walls of the sewers. Very often these doors concealed only shallow niches or small rooms with 1 or 2 shovels, a couple of buckets and the invariable fire extinguisher. But sometimes they were followed by quite decent corridors, which usually led to the basements of residential buildings or to other more exotic places. For example, who among the townspeople knows that there is a sewer well under the slabs surrounding the Lenin Monument, covered instead of a cover by just one of these very slabs, and it was from there that I listened to the solemn speech of the first secretary of the City Party Committee on May 1975, the speech dedicated to the 30th anniversary of victory. Who knows that in the basement of the city bank vault there is a small door about half the height of a man, behind which a layman can see just a huge valve and rusty pipes. Meanwhile, more than once I have squeezed my way through the narrow gap between the floor and the lower pipe and stood holding my breath and listening to the metallic clanking of the grates and safe doors above my head. Who assumes that most first-floor apartments in older buildings can be entered without much difficulty by raising the floorboards in the kitchen? I did not, but many of the family secrets of the residents of those apartments were not secrets to me. If it were me, someone of a different disposition would probably be fascinated by this, by the possibility of knowing everything about everyone. But fortunately I was not tempted by this prospect. And when I met young women who were pregnant by someone else, or married couples smiling sweetly at each other and swearing at each other the day before, I felt no superiority over them. I did not feel superior to them, though, nor did I feel uncomfortable. I should say that I was lucky to be going down at such an early age. Then I could squeeze into such crevices, which, about 5 years later, became inaccessible to me. If I had faced such obstacles for the first time when I was 16, I'm sure I would have given up. But by that age I knew a lot of ways around it, and I was sure I could get anywhere if I wanted to. Yes, I deliberately failed to mention another kind of room that hid behind the doors I came across. They were short, dead-end corridors, usually about 8 meters long, that led nowhere or connected to anything. They were striking for their relatively good finish and their utter uselessness. There was another peculiarity, which I did not realize right away, but which I did realize eventually. Sometimes in these corridors, or to be more exact, under the floor, I could hear a distant humming sound. I knew from my earliest childhood that I lived in a special city. A secret city. A city connected to the secret. What that secret was, I had no idea, and perhaps that's why it seemed big and significant. Everyone has become very smart now. Everyone knows everything. But I didn't know until I graduated from college that atomic bombs were being made in my hometown. And when, having studied for 5.5 years in Leningrad and having arrived at Russian Scientific Research Institute of Technical Physics by assignment, or rather, by summons, I finally found out what most of the city's residents were doing day after day, I was stunned. Shocked to the core. But not at all by what you think. Not by the intimidating proximity of atomic weapons. And not by being involved in an important national cause. No. I was struck by how petty and worthless the secret was. And I did not believe that this was the secret. And I don't believe it to this day. What happened after I got back to town? Probably about the same as everyone else. I became a design engineer with a pretty good salary of 160,000 rubles. I was engaged in cultural work. I had a lot of fun at Komsomol parties. I used to go as a counselor in Ulyanok. Went camping in the spring. I spent my vacations in Leningrad, visiting friends and relatives. Then I met my future wife, took a honeymoon to the Caucasus, gave birth to a son and a daughter. And then came a dead end. The collapse of everything, the country, work, human relations. A marriage, at last. I won't talk about it. Studying at the institute as it were took several years out of my life without connecting it with the city. I can consider myself very lucky in this respect. When I came here again, I looked at the city with the eyes of a different person, a person devoid of any stereotypes and illusions. As a child, you don't think much about the course of life around you, so the city that appeared in front of my eyes was a completely new object for me, one that had yet to be explored and accepted. I realized, for example, that I was completely ignorant of the neighborhoods of the 70s. Not the neighborhoods inside the perimeter, but those immediately adjacent to it. Our family had no car, and if we went anywhere, it was only to Sverdlovsk or Chelyabinsk by regular buses, so for me within a radius of 50 kilometers lay the perfect terra incognita. I still remember a recurring nightmare that plagued me until I graduated from college. I happened to find myself somewhere beyond the checkpoint in the area of, as I understand it, either 21st or Kashtim, and I faced the task of returning to the city, a virtually impossible task because, on the one hand, I do not even know approximately which way the city may be located, although its proximity is a priori set, and on the other, I am bound by the damned secrecy with iron bands, because of which I can't ask the first person a simple question about the location of the 70, which I'm sure is known to every dog around here, so I, stammering with impotence and inability to wake up, am forced to develop an ingenious plan to reach the city through regional centers, about which I know, you can ask anything and in which the bus stops for our buses are, thank God, know exactly where our buses stop, thank God. That's why I greedily immersed myself in the study of my native land. The call of the mystery had not yet sounded with my own eyes, but its distant echoes could already be heard, gnawing at my soul with vague premonitions. Numerous conversations with the residents of 21st, Vozdvizenka, Kluchi and Selkova became for me a window into a new space of images and ideas about our city. And now I no longer remember who first dropped this phrase about the territory that now Snezhinsk occupies. A phrase that stuck in my memory forever. No one ever lived here. What he said shocked me. I do not know what chords it struck in me, but the first thing I wanted to make sure that these were not empty words. My ex-wife, who worked in the library at the time, she still works there, wrote me out almost everything from the Chelyabinsk Foundation that was directly or indirectly related to our neighborhood. It seems that much was taken away during the period when the city was being built and classified, but what I found was quite enough. No one really ever settled here. Yes, blueberries were gathered here, goats were hunted between Lysa, Chamisheva, Volkya, and Teplaya, holes were dug in search of pebbles. Here they harvested timber for the Vozdvizensky glass factory, which was tied up in rafts and transported to the other side of the Sonara. Temporary fishermen's huts were built here. But they didn't live. Well, okay, the Russians, they came here quite late. But the Bashkirs, whose ancestors settled here nearly half a millennium before all sorts of Cossack bandits came. What was stopping them? I immersed myself in toponymy. Having searched a lot of literature, I made two very important discoveries, which confirmed that I was not looking for an empty place. First, I found an exact explanation of the name Sonara, around which a lot of different romantic nonsense is contrived. The first part of the word, sin, quite unambiguously denotes in the southern Bashkirs and Kazakhs grave, sometimes, a statue standing on the grave. To search the basis of the word in the Kazakh, sen, sun, the true, is far-fetched and ridiculous. Its second part, ara, is translated as a gap, the middle. For example, Arakal is the lake that is in the gap, between the mountains. Thus, Sonara is, the lake between the burial grounds, or the lake near the burial grounds. I dare to suggest that this name also had another connotation, a lake near which death. Secondly, with a feeling close to astonishment I found out that one of the decrees of the Chancellery of the Special Isat province of the Orenburg province, mentioned a hill one verst from the noon shore of the lake called Sonara at noon, i.e. about a kilometer south from the southern shore of the lake which the Tatars call Yermy. Whether you like it or not, this is the mountain in the center of town, where the music school is now located. There are simply no other elevations in the area of the southern part of the lake. But that's not the most important thing. Let's leave the reference to the Tatars. These are, of course, the Bashkirs, on the conscience of the author, but the interpretation of the given toponym is known to many pupils of our city, those who, being in Orleanoc, made with Sergei Mikhailovich Roshupkin climbing Yerma, one of the highest mountains of the southern Urals, located near Karabash. The Bashkir word Ur means to walk, me is a negative particle. Don't walk, is a pronounced warning about the danger of climbing this mountain, and in our case it is probably a prohibition to approach the specified area, since, naturally, no ascent here is out of the question. When I shared my discovery with 2 or 3 local authorities, I was advised not to fill my head with unverified rumors and other nonsense, referring to the fact that people have always lived here and lived at, say, near the lake repeatedly found the stands of ancient men of the Bronze Age and early Iron, and that is absolutely confirmed the fact of their occupation by fishing and cattle breeding. Yes, I know all that. Yurka Karpov told me back in the 76s, how he found clay crocks and arrowheads on Petrushka. And other testimonies I know. Aren't you interested in the opinion of specialists in all these finds? Real specialists, not our homegrown schlemans? I am interested, though. That's just it. So, I can show you the conclusion of the Department of History of the Ural University, which summarized all these findings. The sites were abandoned abruptly, the objects left behind were not exposed to the action of fire, nor were they physically destroyed. There are no remains of the dead, which is completely atypical in the case of a sudden attack by the enemy. People simply walked away. Why? Because they shouldn't have been here. You just can't. And if you can't, then you're me. These are just the first strokes of the overall picture created later. The accumulation of critical mass. The first steps toward the mystery. Follow my thought. About work. At first, before all the perestroika and post-perestroika turmoil began, I even liked it. I had to think, solve some problems, move my brain. To tell the truth, the specificity of my work was expressed not in the uniqueness of the problems of constructing spectacles. Any kind of creative work is unique, but in the regime entourage. Regime requirements positively amused. I emphasize, amused, not annoyed, as many of my friends. It was a kind of healthy idiocy, reminiscent of playing in a home for mentally retarded children. It was amusing that instead of taking a sheet of paper and starting to draw or count, you have to do a lot of incomprehensible ritual actions, each of which is characterized by an absolute lack of meaning and does not serve at all what it was originally intended for, namely, secrecy. I will concentrate your attention on this point, because my fun ran out when I understood that from the point of view of the theory of systems all this has the simple name of redundancy. And if duplication increases reliability, redundancy introduces destructive changes into the system, which sharply reduce its reliability. That is the level of regime requirements, existing at our enterprise, does not correspond to the set task at all. I proved this by calculations and made an unambiguous conclusion that either the last moron developed these requirements, in what I had and still have strong doubts, or they have nothing in common with issues of nuclear weapons secrecy. Did I explain what I did not understand? Let me try again. When you notice a thief on the bus who has his eye on your wallet, you will try to move your wallet to another pocket that is less accessible to him. This would make sense. Seeing that the thief does not leave and continues to follow you, you decide to move the purse back to confuse him, and then for the same purpose, you start to move the purse from pocket to pocket. Your first action is to actually ensure secrecy, and therefore the safety of your capital. Further actions of yours become meaningless, because they only attract the attention of the criminal. It is as if you inform him that you have money, a lot of money, making the theft more attractive for him. Most likely, in this case, you will lose your wallet sooner or later. But these actions take on the deepest meaning if the wallet is empty, and your money, and a lot of money, is in the inside pocket of your jacket. So, I decided, as I continued on my way to the secret, there was something in the city that was safely hidden by the existing regime of secrecy. And it is not atomic bombs. Around the same time I had a remarkable conversation with Georgy Pavlovich Lominsky. No, you should not think that I was then on a short footing with the director of the enterprise, the last real director of the enterprise. Who he was and who I was, and the age difference, you understand. Everything is much simpler. The matter was in the pioneer camp Lyanik, which the master visited with pleasure. That time the director of the institute arrived unannounced, walked around the territory for half an hour, and then sat on a bench near the administrative building, waiting for Anatoly Chushkov, then director of the camp. My squad was just on duty, and I sent the pioneers to search for Anatoly Ivanovich, and for 15 minutes, I myself, kept up small talk with Georgy Pavlovich. We had already talked once, so I took the very fact of our dialogue rather calmly. The conversation stealthily turned to me, where I studied and where I work, how they let me out of work in the camp, whether I like the work, and other things like that. After another turn of the topic, I inadvertently asked a question, the answer to which later, much later, so much has cleared up for me. I began like this. Georgy Pavlovich, Here the city was created to develop quite certain weapons. Suppose sooner or later it becomes unnecessary, no matter for what reason, whether the situation in the world changes or somewhere else they start producing more perfect ones. What will happen to the city? Asking then this purely theoretical, even, perhaps, somewhere idle question, I, of course, could hardly assume that in a dozen years it will worry every resident of Snezhinsk in a very concrete expression. And Georgy Pavlovich, of course, then did not think about it. He was silent for a while, a little, but enough so that I had time to think with horror, and whether I have not muttered some obvious foolishness and not offended the elderly man, who gave his whole life to the unnecessary weapon, smiled slyly, but, the smile that had slipped over his face suddenly disappeared, and Lominsky, somehow annoyed, waved his hand in a strange and incomprehensible response.
Is it really a question of this weapon?
Today my question does not seem to me either stupid or naive. And the answer of the master is full of deep sense for me, which has become clear to me only after a decade. There was another conversation worth mentioning. The conversation with my uncle Kolya. From 1950s until his retirement he worked as a procurer at the All-Union Scientific Research Institute of Precision Instruments, knew and saw a lot. When he started to talk, my sister and I opened our mouths and listened with bated breath. However, my parents and everyone who came into contact with him had the same reaction to him. In 1993, in May, we celebrated his 60th birthday. He followed me out to the balcony for a smoke, and, looking out at the setting sun with squinted eyes, he said, continuing the conversation he had begun.
Yes, any supply man has to be a shrew. That's common knowledge. He must twirl to please both ours and yours, and yet he must not forget to do his business. But there is another quality that must be inherent in him.
Uncle Kolya took a drag on his cigarette and continued.
He must be aware of what he is doing. Well aware.
Everybody should know what he does, I answered diplomatically.
Must.
My uncle stressed.
But can anyone, hand on heart, say that he lives like that?
Uncle was silent.
All the time I worked, what's more, all my life I have failed to explain it to myself only once. Only once. How many people can boast of something like that?
What was it that you could not explain to yourself? I only asked to keep the conversation going. Uncle Kolya looked at me a little too quickly, and then looked again at the setting sun.
There was a time, some equipment came with me one day. An echelon of it. I couldn't figure out where it was used.
Is it the duty of logistics man to control the use of supplies? I was surprised. Especially in our situation of secrecy. You might not even know what you accompany and where it goes.
You are silly,
said my uncle in a kind manner.
I might not have known what I was ordering or carrying. But the name, designation, or convention was always known to me. I knew how many pieces of that very unknown with me, how much it weighed, where it came from, and where it was going. Let's say a load of ABC was coming into Sector A for Research B by notional funding C. Can you feel the principle? So that equipment was not associated with any division of the Institute. Its indices had sunk into obscurity.
I doubt that I am conveying absolutely correctly what my uncle said at the time. I only understood one thing. The planners have their own clues that allow them to control the distribution of material resources both in the nuclear center and in the city in general. Don't worry, uncle, I reassured him.
Because it was just one time. Just someone messed up with the documentation with me,
said uncle, with a peculiar expression.
It was just the one time.
He spat on his cigarette butt and threw it down.
But I'm not the only one in the company. There are dozens of suppliers. And I know for a fact there was another story like that in the year 1966. And not with just anyone, but with Petrovich.
Petrovich was an old friend of my uncle's, with whom he had worked side by side for 30 years. I don't remember his last name, but when I was a kid my sister and I often used to visit him. He lived in the third house on Vasiliev Street, in the first, I think, entrance. You are just squanderers of socialist property, I laughed. I wonder how we have anything left in the institute at all. Lavrenti Pavlovich was not on you. My uncle did not take my silly tone. On the contrary, he somehow pulled himself together and got serious.
Lavrenti Pavlovich was here,
he said firmly.
Though very few people know about it. In July of 1947. Here he was, wandering about our marshes. Not alone, certainly, there was almost a company of machine gunners with him. You don't believe me? A man from Kaiserly told me about it. His brother-in-law was a guide. Here's your question. What made the minister wander through that wilderness? He spent 2 days wandering, sleeping in a tent. Do you know where the camp was?
Where? I greedily asked, though a second before I wanted to limit myself to the word bullshit.
I wondered. I don't know if you remember what was on the site of the new surgical building.
I do, I interrupted him. There was a rock, about 5 meters high. We used to climb it when we went to visit my father. He was in the old hospital in 1968, with appendicitis.
You have a good memory, Yurik. That's the rock where Beria spent the night. Remember it better. But don't talk about it so much, you'll be healthier. And remember about the echelon. In case you need it, you never know. Your young years.
My uncle died the same year, in October. His heart gave out when the White House was stormed. I often come to his grave and bring flowers. He unknowingly opened my eyes to many things. Perhaps he knew a lot too, but he hid it well. It was a different generation. Silent. After my uncle's story, my search became more conscious, more focused. At that time publications about the history of atomic weapons began to appear, and in the book The Mystery of 40, I was amazed to find indirect evidence of the possibility that Beria could come to our land at the time mentioned by my uncle. It turns out that on July 8 of 1947 the chairman of the special committee arrived in Kashtin to inspect the first industrial nuclear reactor under construction. It goes without saying that he was needed there, but what could he be doing here, 7 years before the decision was made to build a new institute and a new city? Could it be that the story of Lavrenti Pavlovich's wandering through the forests of Snezhinsk is just a mythical echo of his inspection trip to the city 40? I did not believe it. In my piggy bank of facts connected with the secret, one more weighty fact was added. In the same books I was surprised by the following. In no place did I find more or less distinct explanation as to why the necessity for a new institute had arisen, and why it had been decided to build it exactly where it was situated now. Yes, I have seen the text of the famous decree, read the Chikin's memoirs, read the references to Lominsky's story, and listen to a lot of jokes about it, but everywhere there was a strange bewilderment, covered by deep-sighted demagogic justifications. Judge for yourself. Summer of 1954. The atomic weapon is starting to work. The first hydrogen one was detonated. Mass production factories were mushrooming. Everything was normal. It would be logical to expect a slow, but comprehensive increase in the output so necessary for the country. And then, like thunder on my head, a double of our Zamas is needed. We need it, and that's it. Who needs it? Why? And the explanations, which still bring in defense of this decision. Just listen to their adepts. Some of them say that in case of enemy attack there was a great necessity for one more atomic institute in the rear. Dear friends, let it be known that in 1949 the concept of home front was considered exhausted in Soviet military science and was considered dead and burned out, thanks to atomic bombs, long-range aviation and carrier ships. Others argue that the second center was supposed to foster a spirit of healthy competition that would improve the quality of the products, competition. In the early 50s? There, just for that word alone, one could easily get thrown in jail for 58 years. Paragraph 10, Anti-Soviet propaganda and agitation, at least 5 years in peacetime. Others point to the Jews, saying that there were many cosmopolitans in our Zamas at that time and that it was necessary to build a Kaaba for the Russian man. Here I refuse even to comment, but I can express myself. This is about the need for a new institution. Now about the place. I should say at once, no matter what they say, but neither KB11, Research and Design Complex of the future Arzamas 16, nor the A site, the first industrial reactor of the future Chelyabinsk 40, nor any of the serial plants, were erected on a completely naked place, in terms of communications and infrastructure. There are no words, the difficulties were immense, but there was no idiocy in this respect. The country knew how to count money. It was ours, the people's. I am not being ironic. And they would not have cut down the forest in the deep taiga and built roads there for nothing. It would have been possible to build a facility near the Sorokovka. Fortunately there by this time everything was on the line, well-established production, transport, and fissile materials nearby. Just stretch out your hand. It was possible to dock Snezhinsk to the batch workers in Zlatoust 20, we still work together, inseparably. 5 more options could be named, each of which would be logical in its own way and would not be inferior to Snezhinsk for secret mode reasons. It is ridiculous to think that removing the city to some 30 kilometers from City 40, Ozersk, would make it super secret, as well as for safety reasons in case of an accident. It is possible, everything is possible, but for some reason none of these options were chosen. Why not? And because, for some unknown, but totally unrelated to the nuclear problem reason, It was necessary to build the city exactly at the current location. If my reasoning had followed one after another in the sequence I am describing to you, I would have come to the mystery 5 years earlier. But the point is that they were separate thoughts, views, and impressions, which for a long time did not want to tie into one knot. My biggest regret is that I was lenient enough about my uncle's story about Beria. If it hadn't been for my own good sense, I would have known everything by 1993. But first things first. After my divorce I began to go down to my underground chambers again, after a considerable break. To be honest, I did not think about the mystery there, I simply sought an escape from my ennui and despair, from the feeling of the hopelessness of life. The communications of the new neighborhoods, all those like Vox, Prostokvashins, and Galadeavox, had little appeal to me, inspiring outright disgust with their utilitarian primitivism, so I wandered most often onto the old town, rejoicing that nothing had changed there, that everything there was the same as in my happy and distant childhood. In my wanderings, I once stumbled into one of the dead-end corridors I had already mentioned. I remembered that I had once heard a distant humming here, and even the floor, I remembered, trembled a little beneath my feet. Now it was as quiet and peaceful as a tomb. Shining a flashlight under my feet, I walked around the perimeter of the corridor. I used the rule of my right hand, touching the wall as I walked, and was just about to go out the ajar door, when suddenly something struck me. For as long as I could remember, distant noises had always been heard in corridors like this one. The thought in itself didn't ring a bell. Some transformers or pumps running nearby might have broken down or stopped, that's obvious. But transferring the semantic focus of the inference, I got another conclusion that struck me. In the days of my childhood hikes, only these, unclearly intended corridors were connected to the source of the incomprehensible noise. Again I felt a whiff of mystery. Just a mystery so far, not one that I was already consciously striving for. But big mysteries are always made up of small ones. Back home, I climbed into the couch, where I kept my old diaries, school notebooks, lecture notes and other paper waste. Sneezing with dust, I turned everything over and, from under a pile in the far corner, pulled out a worn, 48-page notebook with an ornate labyrinth inscription. I opened it carefully, and flipped excitedly through page after page. I could see schemes drawn by an inept hand with naive markings of valves and siphons, with careful notations like, "Watch out here. Hot pipe," with numbers showing the number of steps from one manhole to the next. I could not believe my eyes. As a child I had done enormous work, probably comparable to the works of Livingstone, Stanley, and so on. Of course, I remembered well how I took all these notes. I remembered how I drew lines of communication, each time hiding the notebook from my parents and sister in the second row of the bookcase. I remembered everything, but my childlike perseverance, determination and energy amazed me. I was 36 years old, disillusioned, downcast, surrendered. But they also spurred me on, forcing me to act. Looking through the notebook, I realized that this scheme did not suit me. It gave me a complete idea of the arrangement of passages and pipes, but it was not to scale, and I needed precisely this representation to support one of my conjectures. It took me exactly a year to create an accurate map of the underground utilities in Snowdon. There was everything: schemes of water supply facilities, including water supply, sewage and drainage systems, and schemes of heat supply facilities, schemes of power grids and communication lines, and schemes of gas pipes, schemes of basement rooms, and schemes of underground structures which are not advertised and are known by few, and much, much more. How did I get these schemes? Silently. And not because my actions were, as they say, contrary to the existing legislation. And not because virtually all of them were classified, most of them, for official use. But because the people who voluntarily, and often involuntarily, provided me access to this information, are still sitting in their jobs. Let them continue to do so. Don't think that I created my map only from the schemes I received. By the way, I never needed most of them. For the whole year, from the summer of '97 to May '98, I practically never left the ground, and I had plenty of time. At work you know what a mess it was. Even if you wanted to do something, others would not let you do it, those with whom you were chain connected and who had their own problems. Therefore, most have long understood, not to get nervous. You need to sit quietly and wait for money, the only way to exist in our secret box. Well, the boss, in principle, does not care where you are sitting, at work or anywhere else. Maybe others do not, but I always negotiated with mine. Anyway, by early summer the map was ready, and I had to sit down to study it thoroughly. I had to compare the passage of communication on different levels and analyze their relationship to the facilities on the surface. One can talk for a long time about everything I have done, how I made statistical calculations, determining the variance and the average deviation of a number of selected parameters, how I created topological models of areas of interest to me, how I studied the suddenly required technology of pipe-laying by close technique, how I dug through mountains of all kinds of technical documentation, including the most exotic standards, rules, regulations, instructions. In my mind I even assigned myself the title of Candidate of Technical Sciences, which I hopelessly aspired to for 10 years while working at the Russian Scientific Research Institute of Technical Physics. The main result of my research was the following. I found 6 places, where communications were located, so to say, with some single type breach of some existing norms. I am not referring here to defects in work, my God, not a single underground pipeline I know is laid without defects. Responsible persons would be horrified to see their condition. No, we are talking about something else here. In the given places, the communications, contrary to the rules of their laying, contrary to the usual logic, describe a huge arc with a radius of at least 10 meters, in the absence of any visible obstacle, and then accurately maintain the previous direction. And, perhaps most importantly, the center of this arc in all 6 cases is behind the end wall of those very dead-end corridors that interested me 20 years ago. Didn't you get any shivers inside? No chills running down your spine? No? Then you won't understand me, you won't understand why. When I first realized this, I was laughing like crazy, bursting with laughter, choking with laughter, roaring, and I just could not stop, until I realized that I just could not stop, that it was hysteria, and only then I finally calmed down. And I have been known to be more or less restrained. Or rather, I used to be. It makes no sense for me to hide these places if I am to tell you everything. I'll list the landmarks that roughly correspond to them. The first is the department store. The second is the Jubilee Complex. The third, that stinky 11th house on Victory Street, who doesn't know, it's an apartment block across from the bus stop. The fourth landmark is the hill at Sonara, or, more accurately, the parking lot at the 25th house. The fifth is the 121st school. And finally, the sixth is the new surgical building. Of course, you are now mentally trying and failing to understand what these points have in common. 2 stores, an apartment building, a parking lot, a school, a hospital, what connects them? You can go back to the time of their construction, but that will hardly help either. Jubilee and the 11th house were delivered in the second half of the 60s, the department store and the 121st school in the mid-70s, the surgery building in the early 80s. All quite different. Maybe they have nothing in common, other than the irrelevant irregularity of the underground utilities and the presence of some dead-end corridors. Here it is. Here's a map of the city. Watch me. For starters, I connect the points I've indicated with lines. What do you get? The way it should be. A hexagon. Not quite as nice a hexagon. Now look closely. Don't you think there's another elementary, different geometric figure that can be drawn through these points? Well, with a little imagination. Exactly right, the ellipse. And so, if you have even a modicum of thought, not to mention imagination, you probably won't be surprised or claim that my actions made no sense at all when, on Friday, July 3rd, no, wait, it was Saturday the 4th, having waited until the drunken people, and, of course, the accompanying policeman, dispersed from Jubilee, I opened the lid of one of the 2 wells located on the left slope of the complex, threw down the pick prepared beforehand and hidden in the grass, and then quickly went inside, pushing the heavy lid closed behind me, to reach the metal door that hid the painfully familiar dead-end corridor, open it, and go inside was a matter of 4 minutes at most. The presence of the pickaxe clearly indicated the purpose of my journey. I had long ago realized that the wall opposite the entrance was empty, as were similar walls in 5 other corridors. If anything determined the choice of this corridor, it was the proximity of Jubilee to my home. The first blow of the pickaxe was deafening, and I stepped back to cover the door as much as possible, trying to be as safe as possible. Then I went back to the concrete wall and swung the heavy tool again. The concrete gave way reluctantly. Fragments and cement dust fell to the floor, leaving only paltry scratches on the wall. The lantern on my duffel bag illuminated a small section of the wall, where my twisted shadow danced in a fantastic dance. Then things got more cheerful. I got the hang of it, and now and then I had to step aside to keep my feet from falling in especially large chunks. Sweat ran down my face, but I continued my work with the precision of clockwork. Suddenly I felt something like a draft. I turned around to make sure that the door was still closed, and at the same moment I realized what it was. As I approached the wall, I saw that there was a small hole in the center of the crater I had created. I pressed greedily against it, but all I saw was darkness. The lantern did not help either. It was impossible to look and shine at the same time. Grabbing the pickaxe and feeling how close my goal was, I began to strike frantically, blow after blow. The hole became as big as an egg, then as big as my fist, then as big as my head. Then a huge piece of the wall seemed to disappear, falling out into the outer darkness, and I almost followed it, and, in surprise, let go of the pick that had fallen into the abyss. After a moment there was a deafening, echoed blow from below. When it was over, I sat still for another 5 minutes, huddled in the corner by the front door. It seemed to me that the whole city had heard the terrible thunder. I imagined that an OMON unit was on its way down here with orders to capture me alive or dead, better dead. It crossed my mind from some action movie. In any case, for a long time I could not believe that no one besides me had been touched by what had happened. Quite by chance I remembered that in my duffel bag, in a baby food bottle I had 150 grams of medical alcohol. I was preparing seriously. It seemed to me that now would be a good time to use it. I took out the bottle and filled it up to the neck with water from the flask, and I drank the resulting non-Mendeleev's mixture. And you know, I felt better. The truth is that in a minute I began to talk aloud with myself, but it did not particularly bother me. The trembling ceased, and the explorer's instinct woke up in me again. When I came close to the gap I shone a cautious light into the darkness. Opposite, about 10 meters away, a trembling spot of light appeared on the wall. I moved the flashlight back and forth, and out of the darkness I saw another side wall to my right, and a low ceiling, which seemed to be one with the ceiling of my corridor. I did not immediately have the courage to shine the light down, for I had to stick my head and shoulders through the hole I had made, but it was quite impossible to do so, for I could almost see that my awkward movement was causing another lump to fall out of the wall with unhurried inevitability, and with it I was flying into the uncharted depths of the earth. It was 7 meters to the floor. The part of the room that was visible to me was completely empty, except for the pieces of concrete scattered all over the floor and my pickaxe lying a little to the side. To see what was to my left, I tried to stick my head out a little farther, and immediately let out an exclamation of amazement. I had not even counted on such luck. About a meter from the bottom edge of the hole right below me there were metal braces going down into the wall. I vividly remember the feeling of compassion that overwhelmed me. Perhaps it was due to the alcohol I had ingested, but that didn't change the matter. If I had been a believer, I probably would have offered a prayer of thanksgiving to God, but I just started humming Yellow Submarine at the top of my voice, rejoicing at how far my voice carried through the dungeon. Perhaps my euphoria would not have been so complete and strong at the time had it occurred to me a simple question, which I asked myself much later: for whom, in fact, is the stairway leading to nowhere intended? Suddenly I calmed down. My movements became collected and confident. I tied my duffel bag to the seized sling and lowered it down, followed by the flashlight tied to the other end of the sling, and then I threw down the sling itself. The storm jacket, too, was on the floor of the hall when, after an unsuccessful attempt, I realized that I just couldn't squeeze through the hole in it. Finally, to the sound of fanfare in my soul, I found myself below. "Here we are," I said aloud. The lantern's light struck the end wall, which was already familiar to me, and so, bending down hurriedly, I picked it up and turned it in the opposite direction. The light shone out of the darkness. Emptiness. I almost dropped the lantern from my hands. It was so unexpected and, I'm not afraid to say, scary. At first it seemed to me as if a giant abyss had opened before me, on the very edge of which I was standing, helpless and defenseless. But that was only for the first moment. The lantern trembled in my hands, and a beam of light slid down the curving wall. A tunnel. A gigantic tunnel, about 10 meters in diameter, going at an angle of 30 degrees down into the darkness. When I came to my senses, I took a closer look at what my, not very powerful, light source allowed me to. Yes, an imposing structure. Concrete walls with a rough surface. Metal reinforcing rings. And the usual staircase, going down step by step, where the beam of my lantern was powerless. I didn't hesitate long. I put on my storm cloth, coiled and concealed the sling, then, throwing the straps of my duffel bag over my shoulders and hanging the lantern on my chest, began to descend carefully. The steps were wide and comfortable. They were easy to walk up without looking underfoot, but I did not want to fall into some sudden opening hole, so I went down slowly, holding the lantern so that I could see the stairs ahead. At times I shifted the beam directly in front of me, but all I could still see was the vault of the tunnel, encircled by metal rings. When I passed the 100th step, I began to estimate how many meters I had descended, and it was no less than 15. At the 130th step I thought I could see the edge of the tunnel, and after another 10 steps I was convinced that this was the case, and that I was in the darkness that I could not yet see. At the 200th step the descent ended, and the beam of my flashlight rose hesitantly from the floor. I was standing at the subway station. Yes, I was at the subway station. You wouldn't understand my condition. You were ready to perceive what I just told you from the very beginning of my narrative. So now you are relieved to say to yourself, well, finally. He's finally gotten to this place. And you are completely unaware of my thoughts and feelings at the time. Maybe I just don't know how to tell a story, effectively bringing it to the point, if you're not the least bit surprised by what I saw. If you're sitting there now with a lean, polite, calm face. Of course, maybe you just don't believe me, in which case that's another matter. But if any of you don't think I'm making this up, try to understand my shock. The mystery was not at all what I thought it would be. Honestly, I was ready for anything. I was ready to find a secret labyrinth of ancient eras, or a giant bomb shelter, or a powerful gas pedal of charged particles, or food stores, and underground factories, and ballistic missile silos, or even, I suppose, dark strategic transport arteries. But to find a certain underground palace, no, it was beyond my understanding. It ran counter to all my speculation and conjecture. My wooden legs dragged me forward across the thick layer of dust that encrusted the marble floor. I did not feel well. The appearance of the station was in stark contrast to the rough finish of the tunnel I had just descended. A ray of light revealed the thin metal columns clad in corrugated stainless steel and inlaid with crimson-pink rhodonite, the small panels adorning the plafonds built into the ceiling of the hall, and the tall statue standing in the niche at the opposite end of the station. I absolutely lack the right words to describe it, but, just imagine any of the stations of the Moscow subway, and everything will become clear to you. Of course, there was no brightness, glitter and purity familiar to the eyes of a passenger of the capital subway. The only thing that dispelled the darkness was the beam of my flashlight, and, as I said, there was a layer of dust all around. But it was an even, untouched layer, so there was no impression of dirt or any kind of disorder. It was as if the station was covered with a light blanket of gas, as if trying to dampen its intolerable splendor just a little bit. The similarity with the Moscow subway was mainly in the level of aesthetic implementation. In the degree of architectural and artistic perfection. And the difference. From a purely technical standpoint, there are two fundamental differences between the station that opened to me and the stations in the capital, or any other metro system. First, it was almost twice as short as usual, about 40 or 50 meters, no more. And secondly, it was one way, that is, there was only one transport tunnel, the track of which ran to the right of the platform, in relation to the tunnel I went down. The diameter of the tunnel seemed to me to be much larger than the cross-section of the usual, familiar subway tunnels. I walked across the platform and stepped closer to the 3-meter-tall figure in the recess opposite. No doubt about it. Igor V. Kurchatov. But it was not that grim and impregnable Kurchatov, towering now at the 20th venue. Here he was depicted laughing mischievously, with his famous beard slightly upturned forward. In his hands he held a model of the atom with attached to the wire ellipses balls of electrons. His whole figure reeked of such health, joy and optimism that I involuntarily smiled, although I was not amused at all at that moment. The Soviet atomic scientists have fulfilled their duty to the country. I.V. Kurchatov, I read on the granite-lined pedestal. And because of these words, this now defunct word atomic scientist, I suddenly shuddered, with goosebumps running down my back, and an indigestible lump forming in my throat. It was as if I felt the breath of history on me. It was as if I had returned to an era of universal joy and fervent enthusiasm, an era when my countrymen still understood what they worked and lived for and were proud of it, an era of eternal youth and a happy future. For a moment it seemed unreal to me that somewhere upstairs they were cursing the president, dreaming of having at least some money, unable to feed their children, and, most importantly, could see nothing ahead except the inevitable impending old age and its dreadful companion. A giant mosaic panel adorning the opposite wall of the station from the tracks grabbed my attention for a long time. I would have called it the history of the atom, or maybe it really was called that. There, surrounded by cathode lamps, atomic reactors, synchrophasotrons, flashing supernovae, flasks, retorts, all kinds of physical equations with the invariable E equals mc squared. In the center, were depicted Lomonosov and Becquerel, the Curies and Rutherford, Einstein and Fermi, Kurchatov and Landau. By the way, thanks to Lev Davidovich, I later concluded that the station was not designed before the 68th year. Looking at the pattern on the marble slabs of the floor, I did not immediately realize that the intricate ligature was nothing more than a stylized image of an atom. The originality of this image was that each element of the picture spread out on the floor had a kind of self-similarity, and the nuclear planetary structure was repeated within the electrons, protons, and neutrons, and within their respective elements one could again discern the central nucleus and its enveloping orbits. In my opinion, this was a great illustration of the idea of infinite levels of matter and their invariance with respect to scale. In fact, I thought that the sketch of the pattern was created by a mathematician. 2 plafonds adorned the vault of the room, alternating with 3 giant bronze lamps. On one of the lamps I could see something like a spaceship furrowing the expanse of the universe, and on the other, a panorama of a beautiful city with tall buildings and transparent flying machines hanging in the air. Maybe this is how its creator imagined Snezhinsk of the future. Yes, about the air. The air was stale. Not that it had any smell, or that it was hard to breathe, but it felt like a room that had not been aired for a long time. Maybe, really, it only seemed so when unconsciously comparing it to the invigorating atmosphere of most subways in the country. I don't know, at any rate, it was clear that even if ventilation shafts existed somewhere, the exhaust units hadn't been operating for a long time. The air temperature, to my impression, did not exceed 10 to 12 degrees. It was relatively dry. I jumped off the platform and walked a little way deeper into the tunnel. There was no familiar airflow. And the wind from the approaching train did not ruffle my unruly hair. Along the walls stretched thick, dust-covered bundles of cables. Rails and sleepers and the concrete base were covered with the same dust. I put my foot on the catenary mounted on brackets at the side and just above the running rails, but I could smell no electricity even now. Suddenly I felt tired. I realized that I was holding on with the last of my strength and only alcohol keeps me from going crazy from everything I have seen. But the effects of the alcohol had already begun to wear off. I felt a chill and a sense of nervousness that I felt was about to turn into hysteria or a fit of fear. I realized that enough was enough for once. It was time to go back. As I made my way up the 200 steps, exhausted and devastated, I realized what this inclined tunnel was for. There were supposed to be escalators mounted here to take passengers up and down, all sorts of actuators, sprockets, and tensioners. Should they? I asked myself. So where are they? But that question was beyond the power of my experience-ridden brain. I could hardly climb up the scaffolding to the hole, which had been punched 2 hours before, to the window, beyond which the familiar world began, beyond which my native city of Snezhinsk was soundly slumbering in the sweetest early morning sleep. I threw my bag and overalls over there and was about to squeeze through it myself, when suddenly, I don't know what it was. Maybe I just thought I heard a squeak or a screech somewhere far below. But then I froze in place, hovering at the height of the 3rd floor, and, twisting my neck unnaturally, looked into the darkness of the tunnel going down, listening warily and feeling my insides freeze. Then, as if awoken from hypnosis, I threw my body into the hole in one movement, shattering the lantern. Kurchatovskaya station. I muttered nervously, rising from the floor in the pitch blackness and trying at least by the sound of my voice to suppress the fear that gripped me. The exit to the Jubilee store and school number 126. Careful, the doors are closing. After that, I got sick. High fever and delirium. My brain refused to make ends meet. I wandered through dark passageways, and electric cables turned into snakes that stung me. The walls closed in and crushed my body with a crunch. I was constantly thirsty. Constantly short of air. The time of night stretched to infinity, and the days flew by so fast that once I seriously thought that the Earth had stopped its rotation, and it was now eternal day in the States. In the viscous swamp of my nightmares, I tried many times to draw an ellipse through 6 points and couldn't at all, and, that was probably the worst part. The first sensation, after which I knew I was recovering, was the fresh, moist air from the wide open window. It was raining in early August. After that, things got better. Do you think I was still gaining strength long after my illness, not daring to go downstairs again? Like hell I did. I went down there 2 days after I got out of bed for the first time. I went down there, made sure it really existed, and came back. It was enough for me for the first time. Sometimes I think that my illness was sent down from above as a kind of respite, so that I could get used to all this underground business without going crazy. I began to go down every day, or rather every night. I had to sleep at my workplace during the day. I had completely disconnected from life, cutting off almost all contact with anyone, except perhaps only my son and daughter. The underground was my only real reality. I had lost all fear of going down there, though. Remembering the incomprehensible sounds, I now always hung a huge hunting knife on my belt, and my sense of wonder was dulled. It was as if I had begun to do some great work, doing it carefully, methodically, step by step. Yes, I call this place the dungeon. Sometimes, without a trace of irony, I call it the Lominsky Underground. He was the only person in our city whose name I would not hesitate to call something. But more often it's just cold so. There are really 6 stations. And each station, except, of course, for the ubiquitous dust and the lack of escalators, looks like it's just about to get a blue ribbon and a band playing. You know, I often imagine that these stations are illuminated by a bright light, that the platforms are full of people, jokes and laughter can be heard, a fresh wind blows from the tunnel's yawn, and, as if pushing it, an ornate express train rushes out into the street with a noise. And you know, it gives me a lump in my throat. I wish I could ride that blue train every day. I gave the stations their names because, to my surprise, despite their completeness, none of them had metal letters folded into names on the walls. I've already talked about Kurchatovskaya. It became sort of my base. From it I traveled through the tunnels from station to station. I slightly widened the tunnel to make it easier to get in and out, and put a lock on the corridor door, in case of invasion of uninvited locksmiths and plumbers. I had to go to the station to get out of the corridor. Behind Kurchatovskaya, about 600 meters away, in the middle of Poverty Street, underground, of course, Uralskaya station is located. You just can't call it anything else. Imagine red-brown granite columns with emerald green capitals, made of serpentine and amazonite. Trees, real trees. Walking between them you can forget yourself and decide that you are in the woods. And a mosaic panel on the wall. Marvelous mountains, mysterious lakes, deep woods, funny small rivers. Here it is, the everlasting beauty of the ancient and eternally young Urals. And this panel is made not by some smalt, but by the real Ural semi-precious stones, first of all by jasper of various colors and shades, though onyx, serpentine, ophiocalcite, porphyry. In a word, all the treasures of the Urals are here. At the end of the station is a stunning stone flower. The first time I saw it, I spent almost an hour admiring it, unable to tear myself away from this marvelous spectacle. I think the person who carved it is a master of God, just like Bozhofstanila. On the flower sits a large red-green lizard, also made of stone, and behind, on the wall, the characters of Ural fairy tales are depicted, in a very unusual, unconventional, but very attractive manner. Farther along the line is Rabochaya, the one not far from Sonara, under the slide. In the massive pylons along the platform, on the side of the hall, there are shallow niches in which, on low marble pedestals, there are sculptures made by electroplating. I tapped them. They are hollow inside, depicting representatives of various professions. Perhaps they should symbolize the most common occupations of the residents of Snezhinsk. There are 7 of them. They are slightly taller than a human being. Scientist, an elderly man wearing an academic cap on his head, in the hands of his microscope. Engineer, a middle-aged man, counting on a slide rule. The doctor is a slender woman with a stethoscope on her chest. Next to her is a little girl, whom the woman is stroking on the head. The worker is a young boy holding a hammer to his right leg. The teacher, again a woman, this time elderly, with glasses, holding a globe, next to a boy, showing Snezhinsk on the globe, not Moscow, as I first thought. The warrior is an unsmiling man with a machine gun on his shoulder. And at the end of the gallery is Kolkosnitsa, a full-breasted, cheerful girl with a sheaf of wheat in her hands. All of these figures are somewhat reminiscent of the sculptures at Ploshchet Revolutsiy station in Moscow. But it's obvious that they were made by a different sculptor. They are less artificial, but no less artful, more human, more vital. And despite the seemingly naive symbolism, they do not look ridiculous. They reek of pride and spirituality. From Rabochaya, as from the next station, which I call Snezhnaya, another tunnel runs off to the right, but I'll talk about these tunnels later. Snezhnaya is located beneath the 121st school. It's striking in its white marble and other white-colored materials. The most interesting thing is that I didn't immediately realize the beauty of this station. I was hindered by the dust and the darkness. But when my imagination taught me to imagine my underground as it should look in the light of bright welcoming lamps, washed and cleaned, joyful and calm, then and only then, penetrating the soul-killing grayness with my thoughts, did I comprehend the delicate, barely perceptible charm of a winter fairy tale, blowing from every part of this station. Under the surgical building is a station, which after much deliberation, I called Zoologikoskoy, although I understand that this name is not quite suitable. Here you need something less formal, something more gentle, intimate. In the very center of the station there is something like a huge tree or, perhaps, a cliff twined with creeping plants, on which the most diverse representatives of the animal world of our forests have climbed. Elk, bear, wolf and a wild boar have settled on the lower ledges, a bit higher lynx, roe deer, hare, wood grouse are settled, above them, all kinds of minnows like martens, squirrels, crows and woodpeckers, and the very top is a crowned crane kite with its huge wings open. All this is made of black cast iron, and even a layman can easily recognize the famous Snezhinsk castings. Made of gray-blue marble, the columns of the station expand slightly toward the capitals, which look like fantastic plants. It seems to me that the station lights are hidden there, behind the capitals, and I imagine what a soft, caressing light must flood this hall, as if the sun were illuminating the central composition. On the wall again there is a mosaic. The image reminds me of a gigantic ornament, on which dozens, if not hundreds of animals seem to flow into each other, making it impossible to distinguish where one light quick body begins and another ends. I think kids would be crazy about this station, standing there for hours and staring at someone's unknown workmanship. And finally, the last station is Lenin Square. I'm sure that's how it should have been called. Here on the bas-reliefs under the ceiling is little Volodya Ulyanov, and we'll go the other way, and a hut in Roslev, and a speech from an armored car, and peace to the peoples. And something else, made from famous paintings. On the wall behind him on the wall, the aurora is shooting, and groups of sailors and workers are running away with rifles. Okay, I got carried away. Of course, you're not the least bit interested in how these stations are decorated, because you have an understandable question on your tongue, and it's drying your throat. Alright, I'll get to it now, but here's what I want to tell you anyway. The man who conceived of this particular version of the Snezhinsk subway is a genius. A genius, because he expressed the very essence of the city, bringing to life its immortal soul. Think about it. Beautiful people surrounded by beautiful reality, which helps them create and inspires them to new feats. Energetic Kurchatovskaya, Rabochaya, and Lenin Square embody the pathos of labor, creativity and revolutionary breakthrough into the future, and soft and sincere Uralskaya, Snezhinsk as if supporting them, carrying people so they need harmony, tenderness and purity. I would like to live in such a world. Yes, I understand your impatience. Walking around the tunnel caves and admiring the palaces of the stations, I, like you now, was tormented by the same question. Why the subway? And that question instantly disintegrated into dozens of smaller questions. When was it built? Who built it? What was it for? Why don't the townspeople know anything about it? Why wasn't it put into service? Why were no escalators built? Why? 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 Step by step I was getting answers to some of these questions, but I still could not answer the main one. The first thing that became apparent from the very beginning, is that the construction of the subway, for unknown reasons, was shrouded in such a veil of secrecy, of which no employee of any security services in could dream of. The degree of this secrecy can be judged at least by the fact that in a city where at every turn one hears one or another atomic secret, and this despite the supposedly most reliable system of its protection, the vast majority of the population has never heard of this construction, which would be more than enough to spread rumors. After much deliberation I decided that the subway had been under construction for about 15 years, from the mid-60s to the end of the 70s. The lower boundary I determined on the basis of Uncle Kolya's story. Of course, that's where the train with the equipment that never surfaced anywhere in the institute in the year 66th. And, judging by my uncle's words, more than one train. Apparently, to maintain secrecy, such cases were entrusted to different people, and not all of them had the degree of competence and insight inherent in my uncle. Turn in, sign his name, and that was the end. I deduced the upper boundary on the grounds that when I was a teenager, I distinctly heard noises coming from below, and now, reconstructing the character of the noise, I was absolutely convinced that they belonged to the underground electric trains. So at that time work was in full swing, and the subway was being prepared for commissioning. The fact that the end of the work was in the 70s I also decided by studying some features of the picturesque and architectural elements of the stations. This style was typical only for the 70s, and since the design of the stations was in its final stage, then something prevented their opening. About the builders, I have not made a final decision. I do not want to sound ridiculous, making any assumptions, but in Snezhinsk there cannot be no people involved in this construction. Cannot, and that's it. Perhaps some of them, a few, otherwise the information would have spread one way or another, were fully aware of the construction. They are still perfectly aware of all the things I am now telling you about, And these people know how to keep a secret. Others worked there, most likely not even realizing where the place was. A suitable legend was created for them. They took a subscription, they were taken to the place of work in circles in a closed car, and so on. But the bulk, I am sure, were military construction workers who were not our construction battalion, and perhaps also prisoners brought there for a kind of watch. Maybe they did live there, although I have not found any evidence of this. I will be asked, how so? Subway construction always begins with the laying of a mine, from which tens of thousands of cubic meters of soil are removed. Where are such mines in Snezhinsk? Where is the excavated soil that all townspeople had to see? It took me a long time to answer these questions, too. On the excavated soil, I will return, but about the mines, I will tell you definitively. There were 2 mines laid in the city that the townspeople didn't know about for one simple reason: they were both located on ordinary, unremarkable construction sites. Where exactly? Basically, with a lot of thought, you could answer this question yourself. A little hint. Please remember the examples of, perhaps, unique for the 70s long construction projects, which lasted almost a decade. You have to use your brains, you have to know the history of your hometown and all its manifestations. Do you remember? That's right. One of them is the many years of building a new surgery block. By the way, the slogan "Glory to the first builders of the city" was hanging on the building's facade for so long, that, in the end, it began to seem that it was the first builders who laid it. Well, what about the second long-built building? The construction of not only the department store, but the whole complex of buildings on Lenin Square, the department store, the House of Communications, and the Snowflake. Do you think about it? What do you think the procrastination of construction in a city with perfect financing means? And don't you think that these objects coincide with something else? With some of the points I've already told you about. I won't bore you. The answer is simple. The main shaft is now under the surgical wing. And I'll tell you more, this shaft was laid on the site of some older excavation. I found many horizontal drifts, which I have not yet had time to study, because after walking only one of them, I was convinced that it stretches for more than 300 meters, and there are dozens of them. So, I will express the assumption, in fact, it is my firm belief, that the first builders of the subway went down through these old excavations, and then, of course, the mine was expanded. But here's the thing, the mine is wide enough to take a significant number of workers, but it is completely unsuitable for feeding a large volume of soil to the surface. That is, a cage for 20 people is still there, but it is absolutely not adapted for the transportation of rock. There are also no inclined workings with skips, wagons or conveyors. Escalator tunnels? Those inclined escalator tunnels I was talking about do not communicate with the surface of the earth and never have. All this also applies to the second, somewhat smaller diameter shaft under the department store. Of course, there are no cellar entrances into these mines now, for the simple reason that the mines' necks are covered with slabs and poured with concrete of the foundation, on which these 2 buildings, so familiar to the eyes of citizens, are standing. But here's another riddle: at the 4 remaining stations there are no mines. How did people get there? The answer is one, only through the tunnel, which was being gradually constructed. From the point of view of transportation to the workplace, it is probably not bad, get on the train and go. As for the delivery of road headers and return transportation of the same soil, it is still something to think about. But the fact is that the subway was built practically from the inside. Even, it would seem, such objects as ventilation shafts, which are quite accessible and expedient to do from the ground surface, there is a place to turn the equipment, nevertheless, by many signs, were also laid from below. Speaking of ventilation shafts, their above-ground parts still exist. I climbed them all the way to the top, and in 5 cases out of 6 they are inside the buildings of local transformer substations. The ventilating kiosks are surrounded by switchboards, intentionally welded to them. However, the lattices of the kiosks are not sealed, which apparently allows fresh air to enter the metro even when the fans are not running. Partly, it becomes clear why the escalators were not installed. The beginning of the installation of escalators would have marked the surface of the construction, i.e. practically declassified it. Undoubtedly, sooner or later it had to happen. This could not have been part of the plans of its creators, although sometimes I have a crazy thought, which I try to banish, but it keeps coming back to my mind. What if the Snezhinsk subway was built from the beginning as a kind of thing in itself, just for the love of art? For unknown reasons, just before completion, an order was given for an emergency shutdown. Emergency or emergency? The latter was more likely the truth. The fact that all the equipment, probably worth millions of those old rubles, was left downstairs could not be explained by any urgency. Left behind or abandoned? When I first encountered this thought, I felt sick to my stomach. I remember how I was rushing through the dark tunnel from Lenin Square to my Kurchatovskaya, stumbling, falling, climbing, and all cursing and cursing myself for my feeble mind. My brain helpfully suggested an answer, which almost cost me a mental breakdown at the time. Radiation. How could I not have realized it at once? Radioactive contamination of the tunnels. And I wandered through them, gazing around with the curiosity of an idiot, unaware of what lay ahead of me. I already considered myself a dead man. Not a tenant. At home, however, I pulled myself together, and before I ran off to get a blood test, as I had decided on the way, I called a school friend who worked at 20th. The call at 3 in the morning, I figured out the time of day a little later, roused him, but the next day I was down there with a dosimeter in my hand and did not rest until I had walked all around the ring of the subway. There was no radiation. The questions remained, and here's another problem that bothered me. I'll show you on the map. Look. The drawn ellipse covers the 6th, 9th, and 12th neighborhoods of Snezhinsk, that is, the territory bounded by Sverdlov, Vasilyev, Pobudy, Shelkina, and Novaya streets. Okay, let's leave alone the new town, the construction of which at the time of the project, perhaps, has not yet been planned, but, excuse me, why is the oldest part of town, east of Sverdlov? But that's not the main thing either. Even a child will tell you that the subway, as well as other forms of public transport, is mainly created to organize the flow of passengers from residential areas to the places associated with the production activities of the bulk of the population. In short, from home to work. So why doesn't the ellipse of the Snezhinsk subway at least encompass the 9th place? Using the subway for city transportation is not even funny, it will take longer to get down under the ground. There is, however, a tunnel towards the 9th. I've already mentioned the branch off of Rabochaya. However, this tunnel raises more questions than it helps explain anything. First, it is narrower than the tunnels of the main ring, although its track gauge is the same. Second, it doesn't go all the way to the 9th, but bifurcates into 3 dead-end tunnels somewhere near the town cemetery or even closer to town, where a depot is installed. Not relevant, but I'll tell you, there are 9 3-car trains there, in pretty decent condition. From Snezhnaya there's a tunnel of the same diameter and approximately in the same direction, but it breaks off at about 200 meters from the station. A tunnel shield is installed in the dead end. Rails are not laid. Everything. Though these tunnels, Sorty-Ravokny and Tupakovi, as I called them, were not particularly remarkable, I often turned into them from the Koltsevaya line. I don't know why, but their strange difference from the other tunnels made me think they were the key. I wandered there on November 7th, trying to find answers to the damned questions, when something happened that I still can't remember without shuddering. I was walking from the depot along Sorty-Ravokny, and I was about 200 meters from the arrow when I felt a pebble hit my right sneaker. Putting the lantern on the ground, I bent down to unlace my shoes, and at that moment I saw it. The dusty sleepers were clearly imprinted with huge footprints with horrible, crooked claws. What about Robinson Crusoe? He had a rifle in his hands, an axe at his waist, and he had only found human footprints after all. I froze on my haunches, squeezed literally into a lump and expecting that the unknown beast is about to appear on my back, tearing my body with its claws. Fear was literally bubbling up inside me, mingling with a sharp sense of hopelessness. The only way out was a mile or two of tunnels, where, you understand, there was no way to hide or turn around. I cursed myself for my carelessness. I don't know why, but in those 4 months I had completely ruled out the possibility of any danger in the dungeon. The strange noises I had heard when I first came here were, in time, lightly attributed by me to the delirium that was then beginning. Time after time I grew more and more careless, forgetting more and more to take my hunting knife. Now I had no weapon, no way to defend myself. I didn't even try to make any hypotheses about the origin of these tracks, and the only thought that I remember dancing in my head was, not rats. Please, not rats. Gradually the stupor that had enveloped me passed. I slowly straightened up and shone the flashlight cautiously into the darkness in front of me. Then, just as carefully, I shined it back. There was no one there. It was absolutely silent. My reasoning skills were gradually returning to me. There could be no beast behind me. I was walking from the depot, where there was nowhere to hide. So, it had been here before me, and had returned to Koltsevaya before I got to Sorty-Ravokny. I illuminated the sleepers with the lantern again. It was so. Other footsteps went both there and back, and it was easy to see that my footsteps were everywhere on top of them. On top of them, and how on top of them? The prints of my sneakers were inside the footprints of a monster, apparently walking on the tracks like me. I am no tracker, but I was able to make out another, slightly smaller prints, from which I concluded that the beast was walking on 4 paws. Who could it have been? It is now that I present it so coherently and beautifully. But then it was all mere scraps of thought, from which I, rather subconsciously, built a general picture. The image of a giant rat with a fat body, with a long stiff tail, with an inexpressibly nasty grin of upper teeth haunted me. But, listening to the voice of reason and throwing out of my mind the chilling images of horror movies, I suggested that here, simply, a bear had passed by. Where it came from was a second question, but, you must agree, it is easier, and even somehow more relaxed, to imagine this large and, even, often dangerous predator in the subway, than an unknown monster like a mutant rat or some giant hyena. There was only one road, and I slowly moved forward, stopping and listening now and then. For some reason I decided the first thing to do was to get to the station, where I thought there would not be such a hopeless back and forth alternative to my travel. There I could figure out where the beast had gone, and dash along the ring in the other direction, to the saving Kurchatovskaya. I approached the junction of Sorty to the ring. The vaults of the Kurchatovskaya were 1.5 times higher, so the darkness immediately seemed to come closer, opening its arms. I shined my flashlight first to the right, then to the left. There were footprints everywhere. I repeat, I am not a tracker. Perhaps the beast had been walking here a week ago, and I had simply not paid attention to the footprints in the dust. But now I had to decide which way to go, and I, like a Buridon donkey, was faced with a deadly dilemma. I was going to the depot from the side of Rabochaya, and if I did not meet anyone on the way it was logical to assume that that was where I should go. However, who would dare to say that the beast, having walked, say, to Snezhinsk or Zoologikoskaya while I was at the depot, did not decide to visit the same Kurchatovskaya? And I'll just simply wander after him. Or perhaps he is sitting, and was sitting, somewhere on the steps of the escalator tunnels of Rabochaya or Uralskaya, waiting for my return to get to know me better? In the end, I went to the Rabochaya station on my left, mainly guided by one consideration: the closest place to Kurchatovskaya was here. I consoled myself with the fact that, perhaps, the tracks would soon end, turning back, and then I would go forward unhindered. The beast jumped at me from the platform. It was so sudden that I didn't have time to be really frightened. I saw only an elongated black and white snout with fangs under its upturned upper lip, and a light, almost white, woolly body in the light of the flashlight that rose up. I'm sure I was only saved by chance. The beast was clearly guided by the light of my big miner's lantern, which I was carrying a little ahead of my body, so it missed, knocking the lantern out of my hand and knocking me down nonetheless, and hit the tiled wall of the station hard. I jumped up and shrieked wildly, and, without thinking, rushed back. The fallen lantern continued to burn, shining directly at my back, and I continued to run, at first seeing in the light in front of me my ever-receding shadow, and then for a moment the light faded, and I heard behind me the heavy and at the same time soft walk of my pursuer, whose shadow absorbed my shadow and also gradually ran forward with each soft heavy scratching step and the sound of breaths and exhales behind me. Only then did I realize that I had done the only right thing. As I flew into the sorting tunnel to the right, I quickly climbed up the wall, clinging to the protruding parts of the metal tunnel trim and the cables running along the walls. Here I have a blackout in my memory, but I well remember that, having my hands on a protruding rod of reinforcement, I try and still cannot get my other foot behind the cable running under the tunnel ceiling, and at that very moment I heard, or rather I felt with all my body, a heavy shock shaking the wall, and immediately after that I heard a long rumbling sound of a broken cable and a hideous scratching of the metal with my claws. I don't know exactly when, but at some point I realized I was trapped between the tunnel vault and the two cables running along it. How I managed to get in there is still an unsolvable mystery to this day. My butt was hanging in the void, my forehead was resting against the ceiling, and my feet were hanging on either side of the cables. There was no duffel bag on my back, and I half remembered half assumed that I had dropped it somewhere in the 100 yards that it almost cost me my life. There was a loud and unpleasant rumbling sound from below. I assumed from the sounds that the beast was trying to reach or jump to me, but without much success, it seemed. This gave me some optimism, for I had settled down securely enough and was in no danger of falling from fatigue, at any rate. For a long time I could not bring myself to roll over face down. First of all, I thought I would either fall off or the cable would break. Secondly, I thought that my excessive mobility might make the beast furious, and that he, adrenaline-ridden, would get me. And thirdly, I was simply frightened by the possibility of seeing my adversary with my own eyes. It took me a long time to turn around. The beast stopped wandering back and forth in the tunnel and, judging by its heavy breathing, sat directly beneath me, watching my actions. I freed my left leg, moved it slowly to the right, and, hooking it onto the right cable, turned carefully to the right, holding the left cable with my elbow. Then I pulled my right leg up to my belly and, releasing it from under my left, I jerked it to try to get hold of the neighboring cable, and missed. My body went down in an arc, I almost fell off, and immediately felt the impact of air at my foot, and then I heard the noisy fall of a huge animal. But my hands had already gained both supports, and, without waiting for the beast to jump a second time, I hurriedly pulled my right leg up to the cable, caught on it, and only then, having made sure that my position was secure, did I look down. It was not a bear. My lantern was still shining from afar, and in the dim half-light I could make out a huge white-haired creature with 2 black stripes on its narrow, elongated muzzle. A giant badger. My amazement was so great that I felt my muscles go limp, and for a moment I lost control and almost fell down. The beast was almost as big as a bear, at least 2 meters long and at least a meter tall. It raised its head repeatedly and looked at me intently with tiny, barely visible eyes. Twice it came to the tunnel wall, and, rising on its hind legs, it scratched at it furiously, tugging and swaying at the cables. On several occasions it made a disgusting rumbling noise, which made my blood run cold, ending with an angry grunt. Apparently, the beast wasn't going anywhere. Perhaps this tunnel was its home, or perhaps, like many predators, it could watch its prey indefinitely. Of course, I remembered that badgers eat frogs, lizards, and snakes, but I'm afraid that wasn't quite enough for this badger. Throwing himself at me, he made his predilections and priorities clear. About half an hour passed like that. The badger wandered under me through the tunnel, moving away 40 or 50 meters, but coming back all the time. By that time I was able to reason sensibly. I had all the time in the world. I was not burdened with weapons. I was not strong in the muscles, either, but I was determined that if I had to fight him I should either try to strangle him or break his neck. It was ridiculous to think that he would not try to stop me from doing that, but that was a matter of God's will. At any rate, I thought, it might be worth wrapping my left arm in a storm cloth to try to shut the beast's mouth. I am not Mtsuri, but I am determined to fight for my life. As I unbuttoned my storm jacket, I mechanically slipped my hand into my pocket, hoping to find something that might help me, and came across a small object that fit easily in my palm. A lighter. The salt is salty. The Volga flows into the Caspian Sea. All animals are afraid of fire. It's silly, but it was these commonplace truths that popped into my brain as I fumbled for a lighter in my storm jacket pocket. Imagine, the half-darkness of the tunnel, the rumbling predator below, the gleaming rails, and me, pinned by cables to the ceiling and speculating about philosophical problems. Not really philosophical. Not true, not all beasts are afraid of fire. But all beasts are afraid of the pain of fire. The lantern light did not frighten the badger, though it may have thrown him off balance. The beast, like man, like every living thing, is afraid of pain. Here was my chance. At first I almost blew it. It occurred to me to retrieve the fire, and then, by crushing a plastic can of lighter fluid, to unleash a flaming waterfall on the beast. If I had done so, the result would have been, no doubt, to instantly burst into flames myself and, howling in pain, jump right into the mouth of the pecking hot badger. But my guardian angel was somewhere nearby, and I, on reflection, abandoned this ridiculous project. I took a ribbon from the collar of my storm jacket, tied it in a knot on one of the cables, and, turning the wheel of my lighter, carefully set fire underneath. The badger watched my actions warily, and when the flame flashed, he recoiled slightly, hiding his muzzle. Evidently, the light made him uncomfortable in some way. The tiny light at the end of my improvised pipe did not go out, and I proceeded with the second part of my plan. It was terribly uncomfortable to undress under the ceiling, but there was nothing to do. As a drying off, I hung my storm jacket and sweater next to each other on the cable. I ripped the t-shirt in two with my teeth, and then, pulling the belt out of my jeans, slipped one of the pieces of the former t-shirt into the buckle and tied it in a knot. After that, I pulled my sweater back on, wrapped my storm jacket around my left arm, and, settling back down, carefully crushed the can of lighter fluid, taking care to get the contents on both pieces of the t-shirt. I knew the liquid evaporated instantly, so I had no time to hesitate. I quickly brought one of the pieces up to the pipe. The fabric instantly burst into flames, though not as much as I expected, and I dumped it down. I was lucky that the beast stuck its head in its paws in the flash and didn't see the burning cloth gliding down on it. There was a deafening shriek, a sharp smell of burning, but I wasn't looking down anymore. A belt tied around my right wrist with a rag at the end served as my torch, and as soon as the fire erupted, I was free of the cables and tumbled down from the second floor, falling rather successfully on my side without breaking anything. Time stretched out. Hearing somewhere ahead the furious roaring of the beast that was dazed with pain, I climbed up terribly slowly and could not get up, and when I straightened up, I was horrified to find that my torch was almost extinguished by the fall, and the wheezing badger was already turning its face toward me, and its frenzy was about to turn into a frenzy of attack, but I, drunk with some feverish anticipation of a fight, probably inherited from my distant ancestors, let out a wild shriek and rushed at the enemy, and his frenzy turned into fear, which I felt with all my body, and instead of biting my throat with his teeth, he darted away, and I rushed after him, waving my belt, and my torch flashed brightly, and I still managed to reach his pale bouncing ass with my flaming sword, and he shrieked wildly like a rat caught in a mousetrap, and dashed onward even faster, spreading the smell of fear and burnt wool, and I kept chasing and chasing him, shouting something at the top of my voice and waving my belt. At the station the beast jumped onto the platform, skipped past the two nearest pylons, and in the wrong light of my torch I noticed with amazement, how, as if flattened, it squeezed itself into a narrow space of not more than 30 centimeters under the bench, standing by the inner wall. The torch burned out, and I threw the strap on the rail. Then crouched down, leaning my back against the contact rail. There was no joy or fear. The emotional and physical surge was replaced by complete decay and indifference. I didn't care. If the badger came back and started snacking on me, it wouldn't interest me in the slightest. Then I somehow pulled myself together, went to get the lantern that kept shining. In passing I tried, but failed to dread the thought of what would have happened if it had broken, and then quite unexpectedly decided to go see where the beast had gone. I struggled up the metal stairs to the platform and waddled into the hall. The 7 figures were still standing in their recesses, and, shining the lantern around me, I was relieved to see that there was no 8th figure in sight. I don't remember if I told you that each station had 4 benches along the opposite wall of the platform. They entered the landscape of the stations in different ways, but there were 4 of them everywhere. So there you go. Under the second bench on the right was where my recent friend had disappeared. When I leaned over, I couldn't see anything at first, and for a moment I even doubted that it had happened here. The gap under the bench was so narrow that even I could hardly squeeze through it. But then I remembered how a classmate of mine, now a teacher of biology and geography, once told me that rodents like mice and rats have bones in their skulls, the oversized place, so that when an animal penetrates a narrow slit, they sort of fold over each other. Could it be that this creature also has such mobile bones? I lay down upon the marble floor nearest the bench, put out the lantern, and covered my eyes for a few seconds to make myself accustomed to the darkness. Then I pushed the lantern forward so that the light would not dazzle me, and then I turned it on. I assumed I could see a dark, winding hole going somewhere deep. Perhaps the predatory face of its inhabitant. But what I saw was completely unexpected. Behind the concrete wall, about 30 centimeters thick, I saw a tunnel. Exactly like any other tunnel, connecting the stations of the Snezhinsk subway. The same, but not exactly. There were 2 tracks in the tunnel, noticeably narrower than usual. On both narrow gauge tracks were a multitude of low cars going into the darkness, filled with soil. No cables ran along the tunnel walls. There was something else about the tunnel that was not quite normal, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it, and I didn't really try. That was it. There was nothing else I could see. I will not lie. After lying on my stomach for about 3 minutes, I got up and walked away without any interest. Another tunnel, I thought sluggishly. To hell with it. Perhaps you won't understand me. How so, you may say? In a secret subway, and a classified tunnel. How could you not be surprised? How could you pay so little attention to it? But you try to understand me. All my senses were dulled, the usual defensive reaction. I had just been nearly eaten by a beast unknown to science. I miraculously escaped. And you want me to wonder about something, to think about something, or, even worse, to get into its teeth again? However, some work was going on in my brain, and I was sure that sooner or later the result would surface. In the meantime, I slowly put on my storm jacket and hung a lantern around my neck, and went down to the tracks again. On reflection, I decided not to return for the duffel bag. It is still lying there somewhere, not far from Sorty, and, picking up my belt, leisurely strode toward Kurchatovskaya. I was not afraid of persecution for some reason. My story about this incident I want to finish with a small, seemingly insignificant episode. When I had already passed Uralskaya, the buckle of my belt, which I thoughtlessly waved from side to side, hit the tunnel wall, suddenly knocking out a bright spark. I mechanically scratched the fresh scratch on the whitewash with my fingernail and leisurely walked on. Then I stopped and scratched the wall again. Then I scratched the wall somewhere else. I really want to lie that this was the moment when I realized everything. That would have been very elegant, but I would have been wrong. At this moment, I was simply unable to draw any global conclusions. But by metaphorically likening thought to a subway train, I can say that it was then that my train entered the only possible tunnel leading to the destination station. Although if you ask me what I was thinking, waddling through the dark corridors of the underground, climbing the escalator tunnel Kurchatovskaya, squeezing through the still narrow opening of the punched hole, then my words will surprise you, and you will think that they do not have the slightest relation to this entire story. But you would be wrong. Shall I tell you what I was thinking of? I was thinking about tubing. About tubing. If you don't know what they are, I'll explain it to you. There are different ways to build subway tunnels, but there is always the following operation. After the unloading of all the rock blasted or developed by jackhammers, the tunnel lining is assembled. It consists of cast iron rings covering its entire inner surface. The rings are formed of 12 tubing segments, which are bolted together. When the ring is assembled, the cycle of work is repeated, and after about a meter the next ring is assembled. And so on. You've seen these black structures more than once, looking out the window of a subway car. So there you go. I asked myself a question: why, running away from the terrible badger, I, risking my life, overcame an extra 100 meters, instead of climbing the tunnel wall immediately after the attack. Of course, you can assume that my brain was not thinking straight at the time, and that in a panic I did not immediately understand what to do. But I dare to disagree and say the opposite. My mind was working just as it should, even though I was completely unaware of the logic of the actions I was being prompted to take. And there was logic. Iron logic. Cast iron. The thing is that the tunnel lining with tubing, by clinging to which I so deftly climbed to the top, exists only in the Sorty-Ravokny and Tupakovy tunnels. Nowhere else in the Snezhinsk subway are there tubing tubes. Yes, I wasn't just running then, I was running to Sorty-Ravokny, the only place where I could escape from imminent death, because the walls of the entire ring tunnel are perfectly smooth, and the cables go everywhere only at the height of a human being. Why, I thought, had this knowledge, which had helped me at that critical moment, never served as the subject of my thoughts and conclusions. And yet I saw perfectly well the difference between the ring tunnel and the sorting tunnel. And not just in the presence of tubing. I have always mentally called the sorting tunnel narrow because its diameter is less than the diameter of the main tunnel. But just when I realized the problem of tubes, I imagined my own Sorty-Ravokny, and a cold sweat broke out. It's not the Sorty-Ravokny tunnel with its standard 6 meters that is narrow, but the Kurchatovskaya tunnel which is wide. In the Snezhinsk subway, only 2 tunnels were typical of Soviet subway construction, Sorty-Ravokny and Tupakovy. But perhaps, you might say, the Snezhinsk subway was planned precisely as an experimental tunnel, with a larger diameter, with a larger capacity, with tunnel tubes embedded inside the concrete vault. Bullshit. Why don't all tunnels have an experimental diameter? How the hell can there be an increase in capacity with the same gauge? Will the cars be thicker? And about the embedding. There's only one thing I can say about the embedding. The ring tunnel is all metal. Yes, it was by knocking down the line with the buckle that I discovered it. I then scratched through almost 100 yards of wall, and everywhere I saw this very yellowish-gray, brass-like metal. Not a single crevice, not a single groove at least to compensate for temperature changes. It's the same everywhere. And now I will try to briefly state my hypothesis, which you can take as you want. You can make up your own. Let's say, almost all the facts are now at your disposal. But listen to me first. Here is my basic thesis. The ring existed long before the founding of the city. The rest will be easier. Let's start with the aliens, although, in principle, you can take anyone you like, the ancient Atlanteans, the 7 wise men, the Celtic Druids, the Freemasons, and any other subjects you like. The value of this assumption will be approximately the same. So, once some creatures, having at their disposal a fairly advanced technology, have built for their unknown purposes large tunnels in the depths of the Ural Mountains, and maybe then, and not in the depths, and they were not tunnels, but, say, a kind of pipeline system. Well, built themselves, and then either forgot about them, or they are not needed. Years, centuries, and even millennia past, all these deeds, certainly, have been forgotten. because waves of resettlement of peoples, any Huns, Avars, Turks, rolled over the southern Urals one after another, until finally the Bashkir group was formed here, displacing to the north a number of Ugric peoples. But since the Bashkirs weren't into mining, and their predecessors, on the contrary, had a predilection for it, I dare to suggest that the ring was first discovered by the same white-eyed chud, digging in the earth here and there. Of course, their imagination could not help but be struck by it and, as with many early peoples, it was bound to become either a shrine or quite the opposite. Since by mentality, as they now say, the object in the ground was close to the Ugra miners, it was more likely to become an object of worship. Which is probably what happened. After the ousting of the Ugrians by the Bashkirs, the secret cult, shrouded in all sorts of speculation, certainly continued to exist for some time, which tabooed, do not go, the place for the Bashkirs, although the taboo was probably also connected with the fact that the worshippers of the cult defended their shrine with weapons in hand for a long time, ruthlessly killing strangers who wandered here. Anyway, due to the lack of information, the prohibition eventually passed to the domestic level, and the southern shore of the Sonara remained unpopulated for centuries. Of course, from time to time some dashing Bashkir hunter or reckless Russian prospector wandered here. And it is possible that at one point one of these brave men happened to get into the dark depth of the caves and passages under the present surgical building. Was he insane or did he have stronger nerves than our pampered contemporaries? But word of the ring went around the world, until in Soviet times reached Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria. Frankly speaking, I bow my head before the unequivocally courageous act of the chairman of the special committee, who was not afraid to venture a few tens of kilometers away from his main assignment to see with his own eyes whether a dungeon exists. It would, however, be interesting to know whether many of those who accompanied him survived at least till the year of 1953. I'm sure that Beria immediately appreciated the uniqueness of the find. This was only in the Soviet Union. It promised, even if not immediately, even if not directly, a unique breakthrough in science, engineering, and technology, and hence led steadily to the strengthening of the power of the world's first socialist state. The only problem was that information about this in no way became known to anyone else. Perhaps the prospects for using the ring seemed dazzling at the time, comparable only to those of the gaining momentum of the nuclear industry, whose secrets were guarded by the USSR as the apple of its eye. Therefore, the level of secrecy of any information related to the ring could in no way be lower than that of the atomic industry. I argue that this information Beria placed an order of magnitude higher. How else to explain the diabolical by its cunning plan to erect another Atomgrad over the ring, and in its shadow to quietly engage in underground research? Do you know what a legend is? No, not in the mythological sense, but in the regime sense. For example, a medium-capacity paint and varnish factory is built, which produces the enamels and paints needed in everyday life, but underneath it there is a giant chemical weapons production facility. And the workers in the paint factory may have no idea what is being done underneath them. This is called a legend, or a cover-up. So here it is, the city, which will later be called Snezhinsk, with its Research Institute 1011, from which the giant Scientific Research Institute of Technical Physics will grow later, became such legend for the Global Ring Research Project. To this day not a single craftiest American analyst has ever doubted that the secret city of Snezhinsk was created precisely to develop atomic weapons. Replace a small lie with a big one, Goebbels said, and then you will definitely be believed. It remains to be added, hide the global secret under the big one, and not a single living soul will know about the global secret. Imagine that for 40 years the residents of Snezhinsk lived and worked in gigantic scenery, honestly and selflessly performing their labor and patriotic duty. And those sceneries were working, weapons were steadily improving, bombs were detonating at shooting ranges, new citizens appeared at maternity houses, the dead laid to rest at cemeteries, and nobody suspected that this performance was being staged for a specific, quite understandable purpose. I understand that it is not easy and, more importantly, very unflattering to imagine such a thing. Many people will find it simply offensive. Then I ask them, weren't you offended when you were forced to lie to your family and friends back on the big earth about what you were doing? Weren't you insulted when you made up reasons why your relatives, your elderly daddies and mothers, couldn't visit you? Weren't you offended when you taught your children, at an early age, to lie to strange uncles and aunts about their whereabouts, even if it was for a good purpose, as you thought, but still, to lie? No, you were not offended. And only because the state shared that lie with you. And when the state decided that one of you in this pair is superfluous, that's when you felt insulted. Truth cannot be offensive. Now I'll move on to the subway. Imagine, the 50s. Stalin and Beria are gone. There is a desperate struggle for power. Snezhinsk is being built at full speed. The first bombs are going off the shelf. All is well. The play is in full swing. But behind the curtain, things are not going well. Those who have been admitted have encountered a problem, the essence of which we will not go into just yet, a problem that has demonstrated the utter futility of most expectations. In other words, the project was a complete and crushing fiasco. What would you do if you were the people in charge? Disclose? Oh, no. How could it be? I am sure that all relevant documents were, and still are, sealed with an indefinite stamp of secrecy, and even the Secretary General himself could not do anything about it. The money for the project kept on flowing, and it had to be somehow counted. I do not know who could have come up with this idea, a truly ingenious idea. But judging by the way it was put into action, it was the idea of a smallest entrant to the project who was good at finding the appropriate expenditure items, and who knew how to write off the money that remained at the end of the accounting period. Judge for yourself. The project could only be declassified if the ring ceased to exist. And since its physical destruction was very doubtful, it was thought to destroy it on paper, simply by giving it another name. Do you feel the clerical language? To declassify Object X for lack of it, write off the money from the balance sheet of Object X to the subway named after G.P. Lominsky. That's all. Simple and ingenious. With the stroke of a pen, the obscure ring disappears, and instead, the necessary subway appears. And the metro was built. In the same environment of extreme secrecy, because until the end of construction, the security Object X continued to exist. And if you estimate how much money was invested in it, then you can clearly understand what hopes, in monetary terms, were pinned on the project. You will ask, how do I fit into my hypothesis the gigantic badger in the tunnel hidden behind the wall? It is very simple. I proceeded from the assumption that the main task of the subway developers was to maximize the use of the existing spaces of the ring. Considering that I saw a tubeless 9-meter tunnel in the badger hole, taking into account the presence in it of wagons with rock, as well as remembering the absence in my childhood of rows of trucks with the removed soil on the city streets, I made a conclusion that the 6 stations were created at the junctions of the radial tunnels that converge somewhere in the central part of the ring. This place, according to my calculations, is under the Solnechny store, and the soil extracted from the places of future stations was taken out, or, more precisely, brought into the center of the ring, through these radial tunnels. After the development of cavities for stations, the radial tunnels were sealed up, and in the center there remained dumps of unnecessary rock. As for the badger, I assumed that once there were several families of these animals, and in the absence of enemies, they gradually, from generation to generation, increased in size, became whitish in color, and possibly lost their sight. In short, they slowly changed, adapting to their environment. Here, in general, is my hypothesis, which I formulated for myself at the beginning of this December. Everything known to me fitted perfectly into my version. In particular, it was logically explained that since the ring existed independently of the city and was not originally planned for use as a subway, for this reason, the existing subway did not affect part of the old quarters, and the vital tunnels towards the 9th had to lay the usual subway methods. The mystery of Snezhinsk no longer exists for me. There remained only the mystery of the ring's origin, which, it seemed to me, sooner or later I would be able to discover. It did not occur to me then that I had not yet answered the basic question, why was the construction of the subway never completed? And I did not yet know that the answer to that question would force me to reconsider all my previous constructions. I didn't go down to the dungeon until the big picture was finally, as I thought at the time, clear to me. It was only after that I began to think about a new trek. To tell you the truth, the memory of the badger still made me wake up at night, but that was just getting out of my head. In reality, I almost ceased to be afraid of this beast, assuring myself that the tool I found, fire, was a reliable protection against too close attention treacherous underground creatures. I had also borrowed a gas pistol from a businessman I knew, hoping, however, more for the sound of the shot than for its daring effect. My plan in brief was as follows: to enter the radial tunnel through the badger's passage, to reach the supposed center, to ascertain the existence of the other 5 radial tunnels, and, if possible, to examine the central part. I imagined the center as a kind of cavity, where all 6 tunnels converge and in which man-made dirt hills dumps, drilled from top to bottom by giant badger holes, are towering. I had no idea that the planned hike would be my last. On the 5th of December, almost a month after my meeting with the badger, I re-entered the dungeon. I reached the mysterious bench without any adventures, not noticing any extraneous traces on the way. However, at the station itself there were more than enough traces. At first I lay on my stomach for a long time, shining the lantern and looking into the dark perspective of the tunnel through the opening. I saw no movement there, but I was tempted, nevertheless, to fire my pistol a couple of times, and I had great difficulty in suppressing this unreasonable desire. I shoved a bunch of improvised torches, 5-meter-long sticks wrapped in diesel-soaked rags, through the hole, carefully lit my remaining torch. It burst into a bright, smoldering blaze, and, shoving it in, waved it threateningly. There was no response, and with a grunt I began to squeeze my way through the narrow opening. This was no longer the familiar ring, which I knew like the back of my hand, but something new and unknown, and I could not help but shudder as the brilliant, yellow-gray vault swung open above me. The flames reflected and shimmered in the mirrors of the whitewashed metal walls, so that was what made this tunnel different from the other tunnels in the ring. Without letting go of the torch, I got up on all fours and, picking up a loose bundle from the floor, hooked it to a hook sewn into the collar of my storm jacket. Then I stood for a while, gathering my courage, and moved cautiously into the passage between the two rows of carriages. A lantern hung from my chest, and in my right hand I held a pistol, and in my left a torch. The torch was blinding me, so I drew it back a little now and then. After 50 yards the trolleys were behind me, disappearing into the darkness, and with them the sense of security. I walked between the two narrow gauges, looking ahead and counting my steps. There was something I did not like, but I could not tell what it was. After about 10 minutes there was a small patch of darkness ahead, which grew darker and darker as the tunnel circled around it, and I realized that I was approaching the exit, beyond which a darkness beyond the reach of my lantern was gathering. The tunnel ended. A gigantic hall opened before me, the size of which I could not measure, but rather could only feel. The floor was on the same level as in the tunnel, and the ceiling was domed upward and forward. When I shined the light, I saw a wall of the same yellow-gray metal, or was it an alloy? To the right and left. It looked like my assumptions were correct. A radial tunnel led me into the central cavity. Judging by the distance I walked from the Rabochaya, this cavity was no more than 200 meters in diameter, as I had roughly imagined. But there was something that did not fit my picture at all. There was nothing in this gigantic chamber even remotely resembling mountains of excavated earth. The floor of the hall was covered with something that at first I mistook for a layer of dust over many years. However, after taking 2 or 3 steps from the mouth of the tunnel, it seemed to me that the floor sloped slightly toward the center of the hall. I was convinced that this substance could hardly be called dust in the usual sense of the word. The grayish substance beneath my feet did not rise into the air like dust, but flowed like water, closing at my ankles and leaving no trace. It resembled ash in density. Its weightlessness and fluidity were strange and unpleasant. Forcing myself to walk toward the center of the hall, which lurked in the darkness, was scary. I wanted to stick to the wall, so that if necessary, my back would be against it and I could repel the attack of an unknown enemy. So, on reflection, I decided to go to the left to see if there were any other radial tunnels, as I had planned. Putting the torch in my right hand and the gun in my left, I walked slowly along the wall, looking back and listening. After a dozen steps I realized that the wall was rounding, and after 100 meters the mouth of the tunnel opened up on my left, apparently heading in the direction of Uralskaya. 100 meters later I found another tunnel just like it. My assumptions kept coming true. 100 meters by 6 exits, 600 meters, I began to count. That's the circumference of the central hall. 2 pi r. Consequently, it is not difficult to calculate that it is no more than 100 meters to the center from here. 100 yards. 15 seconds there, 15 seconds back. With these figures I convinced myself to get away from the wall and venture to explore an area lost in the gloom. But other calculations began to creep into my head. I began to count the cubic meters of soil that once occupied the space of modern stations, and mentally pile these cubic meters into the hall, spread out before me. It turned out that there must be so much rock that even if the center was filled to the ceiling, there must also be enough rock on the periphery of the hall where I was now. But where was it? Maybe the soil was not dumped here after all? No, definitely here, the wagons clearly say so, some of which even remained filled. Or maybe there is a shaft in the center of the hall into which all the excavated rock was dumped. The torch burned out, but I did not light a new one. We must make up our minds. Cautiously tapping a burnt stick in front of me, I moved forward. The floor began to descend steeply, so steeply at first that I stumbled and almost fell, and then more gently. After 10 meters, I was already knee-deep in a fluid, grayish substance that did little to hinder my movement, but somehow had a tangible effect on my nerves. There was something of a lurking living creature in it, ready to suddenly attack and devour a lone traveler. Nerves, nerves. Gradually a distinct vertical outline began to loom ahead, gleaming faintly in the light of my lantern. When I came closer, I saw a column going to the ceiling, mounted on a strong, about 5 meters in diameter metal surface, which was slightly above the level of the grayish stuff, in which I was immersed almost waist deep. I came close to the base and poked it with a stick, just in case. Nothing happened. As I lifted the beam of the lantern along the column, I found the ceiling of the hall at the height of a 5-story house. The column seemed to be touching the dome, and if there was any gap, it must have been quite small. Putting the gun and the burned-out torch on the base, I leaned on it with my arms and tried to climb up. Then I heard a sound. A sound coming from the thing that appeared to me to be a dead piece of metal. And then I saw the beam. No, first there was a bluish-white spot on the surface of the column, about 2 meters from the base, which flickered for a few seconds, fading and then flaring up, and then a beam began to extend from this point. It was extending. Like a radio antenna. But it was a beam, a blue beam, slightly dispersing the darkness around it, still no thicker than a spoke. Its end drifted slowly, as if reluctantly, toward the walls of the hall, invisible to me. About a minute passed. The beam, flickering, continued to hang in the air, when suddenly the tone of the sound still echoing abruptly changed, and the beam seemed to slide down along the column, unfolding into a plane. I watched, hypnotized, as the foggy streak grew, and on it, like a screen, a bluish glow swirled and flashed and shimmered. It took less than a minute for the beam to reach its base, and to my right a glowing 2-meter-long trail of light froze in the air, stretching from the column into the darkness of the hall. And at that moment the tone changed again. And I was horrified to find that the plane began to rotate as if around the column, forming a glowing segment of space in the air, growing larger and closer to me with each passing moment. In the next moment, it all went by at the speed of a fast-moving movie. A snarling, wheezing ball of something sprang out of the glowing void, burst into the dust, jumped out of it, rushed into the darkness with a guttural croak, and disappeared, only to reappear in a great arc at the base on the other side and freeze in the light of my lantern, staring at it with the frantic pupils of its round eyes, and everything sank down inside me, for it was not a badger but some terrible monster, resembling an enormous toad covered with fur, with a pulsating throat and saber-like fangs protruding from its mouth, and all thoughts of fire or a gun flew out of my head, for so much of the wild, so primal was the creature, that nothing seemed to be able to stop the angry creature, and the next moment it jumped. But I ducked, almost dove into the grayish abomination, and the toad, rolling along the base, came down somewhere behind me, and I darted to my left. I rushed to the left, trying to leave a column between me and the monster, but it jumped again, and for a moment I felt its hot stinking breath, and I rushed forward with all my might, but my way was blocked by a glowing piece of space, and I had no choice but to crawl under it, falling on all fours. The thought of running through it seemed insane to me, and, gasping for breath from the gray powder that clogged my mouth and nose, I jumped up, turned around, and through the translucent canopy, which had already turned a quarter of a circle and was still unfolding toward me, saw the bloodthirsty beast, which, crouching on the floor, leapt at me through the glowing mist at the very moment when something weaving out of the air gently touched my forehead. I came to my senses lying on the base of the column. It was quiet. I distinctly remembered what had happened to me until the moment when the beast jumped on me. And I distinctly remembered what I saw next. The first person I met when I returned home that morning was the neighbor from the apartment across the street. I said hello to her, but she looked at me strangely and walked past. Opening the door, I felt that she stopped on the landing between the floors, and turning around, I caught her strange, intense look. She hurried downstairs. This could warn me, tell me something, caution me. But I did not pay much attention to that fleeting episode, and therefore was completely unprepared for the fact that, after throwing off my dirty clothes and going to the bathroom, I saw in the mirror an unfamiliar face. This shock is impossible to understand in your mind. It must be experienced. I was smart enough not to look at my reflection again, and I was smart enough to convince myself that I was unspeakably tired, that I was dirty as hell, and I just needed a good wash, shave, and rest so that my familiar features could be reflected in the mirror again. I needed time to recover. Just a little time. My travels underground had taught me to live my life by taking everything that happened to me for granted. So, snorting under the shower and fiercely scrubbing myself with a washcloth, I was completely calm and mentally ready for anything. The face in the mirror was mine. But 15 years older. I remember your perplexed faces when I told you that I was born in '61. You wanted to ask me something, but on reflection you left it for later. A simple calculation gave you the figure 37, But you were more likely to believe your own eyes, and it turned out that I could not be less than 50. I am indeed 37. I can show you my papers, although I know that's not proof. No, I don't have AIDS or cancer, as my acquaintances whispered behind my back, ready in advance to feel sorry for me and mourn my untimely death. And I don't use drugs, which is also a rumor. I am amused by all these rumors. I might add that I haven't had the kind of shock that makes one go gray overnight. Look, I have a lot of black hair. I just got older. It's not just my face that has changed. I really feel 50. My joints ache, my heart tingles, my liver aches in the morning. I go up to my third floor with shortness of breath. A week ago I went to the eye doctor and immediately ordered glasses, and the day before yesterday I put them on for the first time in my life. Good glasses, comfortable. If you want to feel sorry for me or say something sympathetic, don't waste your words. I don't feel like a victim of circumstance. This is life. Which, I repeat, mustn't be taken for granted. From the ophthalmologist I went to the psychiatrist and had a little chat with the man. I found out that I was mentally healthy and asked if I could get a certificate to that effect. He had a pen ready and asked about the organization to which such a certificate should be submitted. I could have made up anything I wanted, but I told him I personally needed such a certificate. At this point our conversation lost its casualness, and I heard a strange question, "Is something bothering you?" "But you acknowledged my mental health without asking that question," I remarked. He put his pen away and said that my request was somewhat unusual, and that normally such certificates are only issued at the request of interested organizations. In other words, I concluded, the fact of asking for such a certificate already indicates some kind of mental abnormality. Well, alright. I'll bring the request. But after I get the certificate from you, I will tell you about the fact that under Snezhinsk there is a huge dungeon, where there are terrible beasts. Will my story affect your diagnosis? He looked at me with some strange expression, and I realized that I had overstepped my bounds, thinking it best to leave at once. As I left, I noticed that he was looking at the cover of my medical records, as if he were memorizing the name better. Or maybe it was the year of my birth that caught his eye. I don't think that's where the rumor of my abnormality came from. Doctor-patient confidentiality is doctor-patient confidentiality. I suppose I instigated that rumor, mentioning 2 or 3 things I shouldn't have. It's a strange thing. When I was a boy, not one person, not one of my closest friends, not one girl whose imagination I needed to impress at all costs, knew about my trips underground. Although, I remember well, the temptation was unbearable at times. Back then, as a child, I was able to keep my secret intact. But now, my natural restraint is more and more often cheating me. Perhaps my nerves are really not good. But it's a fact, people are whispering about me behind my back, but if it weren't for that whispering, you wouldn't even know I existed. Or about anything else, for that matter. Worse than that, I have felt quite a lot of attention on my person. And I can guess where it might be coming from. The first warning was the disappearance from the apartment of all the photos taken underground. And there were quite a few of them, probably 100 or even more. When I came to my senses I found that not only the pictures were gone, but also some of the diagrams that helped me to navigate underground. This last loss doesn't make much difference to me, though. I feel being followed. Ordinary, banal surveillance. Don't be so quick to ascribe to me a stalking mania, if only for the simple reason that it doesn't bother me at all. I told you before, I'm not afraid of anything. And to convince you, take a look out the window, a good pun for your newspaper, isn't it? Do you see there, on Tsiolkovsky Boulevard, strolling in a 30-degree frost, some weirdo? Well, he's not a freak. That's his job. To hell with it. I want to summarize something. I was let down by my pride. I thought I had it all explained to me. The facts that did not fit into my scheme I considered insignificant. But how could I not understand that primitive empty tunnels underground would not attract Beria's attention? I was obliged to understand that there must be something else there. The all-powerful minister could not but be interested in the story of monsters falling out of nowhere, because behind these monsters, with his usual perceptiveness, he was able to discern the existence of the door to another world and the prospects associated with it. And it was this that formed the basis of the super-secret project. But knowledge is not given for free. The project failed, not because of its futility, as it originally seemed to me, but because of the disaster, the extent of which can only be guessed at. The door turned out to have a secret. Spatial changes in the ring were accompanied by temporal changes, which, moreover, were not confined to the ring's boundaries. I could have guessed that before, without having tested the fact of rapid aging on my own skin. Why Why the hell had I been so lenient about the prohibition on settling here, attributing the taboo to natural religious reasons? Only now did I realize that it really was deadly to live here. The column was working, and the time radiation, as I called it, was effective even on the surface, where life expectancy was much lower than at a safe distance from the cursed place. There it is, the Sonara phenomenon. Only now I put the legend of the Bashkirs, recorded in the area of Kashtim, in the general line of what I know. It is similar to the legends of many nations about a day spent in an enchanted kingdom, which turns into years in real life. Only here it is the other way around. Sagandike, who had broken away from his comrades and hunted in a forbidden place, returns to the fire as a deep old man, in whom no one can recognize the young Batir. I myself am the living embodiment of this legend. Forgive me those who began to pile up the column. Now I know, it happened not after the start of construction, but even before the idea of the subway came to someone's mind. And it had nothing to do with the problem of excavating debris, but with the intense struggle for life. At some point, a catastrophe broke out, clearly showing what danger lurked in the center of the ring, and the researchers of the entrance to the other world tried to the best of their knowledge and ability to isolate the already existing city from the unknown radiation that causes old age and death. Remember Chernobyl. Remember the sarcophagus over Unit 4. Remember how many health and lives were taken away by its construction. Remember and speak kindly of these people. Here in Snezhinsk they performed a feat comparable in heroism to that of Chernobyl and the liquidators of the accident at the chemical plant Mayak. A feat that perhaps no one will ever learn about. No one will ever know how many people, scientists, engineers, workers, grew old and died in front of their comrades, taking deadly doses of years for a few minutes of work near the column. Doing what should have been done. Again, forgive me. Forgive me for my thoughts. For having been, at least in my reasoning, somewhat unfair to you. Perhaps at first the radiation of time was completely blocked by thousands of tons of soil, and the experiments have shown that all is clean, and therefore in someone's brainless head crept insane idea of building this ill-fated subway, and no one thought that the column, perhaps, and under the sarcophagus continues its unknown work. Lord, make us see reason, guide us on the right path, and reveal to us when, at last, we will learn to stop building kindergartens near reactors, building schools on radioactive burial grounds, and building sanatoriums near poisoned rivers. When will we truly understand that we live on Earth for something greater than our immediate selfishness and vanity? And maybe until we know this with our eyes, it would be better for our hands to shrivel up rather than to do crazy things. When I came to, stretched out on the base of the column, I found a handful of dust in the place of the gun and the torch. The same slippery, grayish dust. Yes, the sarcophagus above the column had failed. Hour after hour, day after day, destroying, pulverizing, vaporizing mountains of soil that had filled it, or perhaps even feeding on it. The column continued to act, and at the moment when the hopes of those who had erected the sarcophagus were dashed, radiation again spewed out. The adventure failed. Thank you for trying. Construction was halted, access to the dungeon was cut off, and the city was abandoned to its fate. Again and again I asked myself, why did this happen? I do not believe that the doomsayers and decision-makers lacked the insight to understand the danger of the ring. Nor do I believe that there were not enough funds to evacuate the city and rebuild it. Nor do I believe that there were not enough decades to do it. If they lacked anything, it was common decency. A city where thousands of people lived, worked, loved, was abandoned to its fate. To death. Of course, it could not be compared to the instant death of a neutron bomb. If, near the column, one grew old and died in a matter of minutes, then above, death was no longer so pronounced, life was simply shortened. And who in our God-forsaken country would be interested in an increase in early deaths? The Sasquatches themselves? Well, the curious, if there were any, were put in their place by a reminder of the regime requirements and specifics of production, nodding casually, but very significantly, at the fish bodies of the bombs, saying that they were not assembling irons. The scenery also reeked of death. But the more I think about it, the more often a terrible thought occurs to me. It seems to me that the city was not abandoned, but left behind. Abandoned for well-considered, sober reasons. The project was not terminated. The research continued. And it goes on. Some are writing monographs. Some are getting PhDs and doctoral dissertations. Someone is awarded closed state prizes, for study of tau radiation influence on human organism and investigation of possibility of hereditary transfer of traits appeared in the first generation. The field of research is truly limitless. 50,000 people. Power is as disgusting as the hands of a barber. I see on your faces the question. What to do? Run? Escape? Try to fill up the column again? Blow it to hell? Who to hope for? Who can we count on? Who can help us? I'll answer that last question later. As for the rest, it's no use burying the problem in the ground or walking away from it. The problem must be solved. Which means, one way or another, the city must cease to be a hostage. But not a hostage to the ring, as you now think, but to the secrecy that surrounds us on all sides. It is not so much the external, formal, hard-edged secrecy, as the one that has accumulated in our souls and is simply called a lie. Its snows have covered our city, covered it with a weightless but reliable blanket, covered it with an impenetrable veil, not allowing us to look at ourselves from the outside, preventing us from a sober assessment of our actions and deeds. And this, it seems to me, is the reason for all our troubles today. Uncle Kolya used to say, a man must always be aware of what he is doing. Be very aware. Yes, Kolona sows death and breeds monsters, but I'm sure these are all external, secondary signs. So don't you think that whoever first decided to hide them from the world simply put a roadblock in the way of understanding the essence of the phenomenon and thereby doomed us to suffer from these collateral phenomena? And don't you also think that by getting used to living in an atmosphere of half-truths and sometimes outright lies, we, ourselves, have unwittingly helped him in this? The column is not evil, it is only a soulless mechanism. You can't get close to a nuclear reactor, either, but that doesn't mean it's designed to be entirely harmful. You just have to figure out how to use it properly. One more thing. Behind every mechanism is a mind. Remember when I woke up, I found a handful of dust. All that was left of the torch and the gun. But I hadn't become dust. That's encouraging. It makes me hope that my last trip to the underworld isn't truly my last. For all of us. I remember well what I saw after the monster jumped on me and disappeared again into the blue mist. So I think I know how to answer your last question. I know who can help us. I will tell you how to find him. First, you have to go out into the streets of Snezhinsk, walk through its nice, snow-covered streets, breathe its clean, frosty air, look around, smile at the girls you meet, help an old lady to carry a bag, to cross the street kid, and then, without hurrying anywhere, get to Jubilee, go down into the left of the two wells on its eastern slope, walk, crawl to the discreet metal door, enter the short hallway, squeeze through a narrow opening, go down 200 steps, wave to Kurchatov, jump off the platform onto the tracks, walk along the sleepers for 1.5 miles, climb the Rabochaya platform, crawl under the third bench from the left, pass a long line of carriages, step into the flowing dust of the hall, approach the column, be patient and, waiting for the blue fog, without hesitating for a second, plunge into its shining depths, and at the same moment feel the strong, reliable hands of support, and, opening your eyes, see young, cheerful people in front of you, so similar to those depicted on the mosaic panels of the Snezhinsk subway, and then you only need to look closely at their faces to realize with amazement that these are the same people who fill the streets, boulevards and squares of the city. These are our friends, relatives and acquaintances. Only in their eyes there is no trace of mental turmoil, disappointment, grief, callousness, no trace of pain and fatigue, of hatred and resignation, which seemed to be imprinted forever. None of this. All disappeared like dirty snow under the rays of the sun, like black ice cracked by spring water, like a deceitful mask torn away by the wind, vanished, and only one dazzling blue glow of the eternally young soul of Snezhinsk remained, a glow that merges together strength and kindness, joy and spiritedness. And at that moment, at that bright moment of awareness and amazement, a warm, enveloping wave will come, at last, the long-awaited understanding that it is they, the Snezhinsk people, fellow citizens, brothers, it is they, only they, and nobody else, can help us in all our troubles, in all our grief and hardships. Only they can help us. To us, and to ourselves.